Welcome back, traveler. Tonight, we're going to take a journey back to a time of darkness and courage where every whisper could mean the difference between life and death. Picture yourself in Nazi occupied Europe. The air is thick with fear, and even the smallest misstep could expose you to unimaginable risks. But in the midst of that terror, people came up with some incredibly clever ways to communicate without ever being caught. Yes, we're talking about the kind of top secret codes, covert messages, and shadowy tactics you've probably only seen in spy thrillers. And no, you probably won't survive this because trust me, not everyone did. It's a thrilling, dangerous world, and tonight we're going to unravel it together. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from, so drop your location and local time in the comments below. Let's see how far this journey reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin with the most basic yet incredibly effective form of secret communication codes. Now, you've probably heard of the phrase, a code is only as good as the key. And in the case of civilians during the German occupation, that couldn't be truer. Ordinary people, shopkeepers, farmers, teachers, had to become experts in the art of coded speech, transforming their daily conversations into covert operations. Imagine you're sitting in a cafe sipping your coffee or what's left of it, and the person across from you leans in slightly, speaking in a tone that barely rises above a whisper. What's being said? Well, the words seem normal enough, but you catch a slight change in intonation, a pause in the middle of a sentence. That's when you realize this isn't just casual chit-chat. It's a coded message. A simple sentence might be laced with hidden instructions designed to go unnoticed by anyone else but you.
Historians still argue whether the most common form of these covert messages were simple letter shifts. A cipher such as the Caesar cipher or something even
Subtler, like false accents or changes in tone used to encode an important note. But whatever the form, the key was always the same. Don't give it away. The ingenuity didn't stop there. Messages didn't just need to be concealed. They also had to be transmitted quickly, efficiently, and in such a way that no one would ever suspect the sender. One of the most fascinating tools for this was the use of spoken language. Yes, that's right. The words you say every day could become your biggest ally. Take, for instance, the use of double talk, a form of communication where the true meaning was hidden in plain sight. A conversation might sound completely innocent to the untrained ear, but with a little practice, you could decode it in an instant. Consider this example. A man might say, I'm meeting my brother tomorrow. He's an expert at gardening. To the unknowing observer, it's just a chat about family and hobbies. But to someone in the know, the term gardener might actually refer to a weapons specialist. Subtle, right? But the key was that these exchanges could happen anywhere at any time without the enemy ever realizing what was going on. In occupied France, these methods were particularly crucial. The French resistance was spread thin with many members, forced to communicate in broad daylight surrounded by German soldiers. Ordinary phrases became vital lifelines for those in the know. But codes weren't just reserved for private conversations. No, civilians had to go even further, getting creative with the very objects around them. Historians often debate whether this widespread use of codes and hidden messages was a product of sheer desperation or of an underground network that had been building for years. What's clear, however, is that necessity breeds ingenuity. And in times of war, when everything is on the line, the most mundane aspects of life, like a simple trip to the market or a visit to the post office, could become the setting for life or death decisions. But codes weren't the only tools in the civilian resistance arsenal. There were plenty of other ways that the everyday citizen could communicate with others without raising suspicion. You see, once you've got the right code, all you need is a trusted person to pass it along. And that's where message runners came in.
These weren't just spies in the traditional sense, but rather ordinary individuals who knew the importance of every package they carried. Whether it was a letter or a simple bundle of fabric, they would move through enemy lines, often under the cover of darkness, delivering vital messages from one point to another. It's remarkable when you think about it just how many times these brave souls must have crossed paths with German soldiers, not knowing if this would be their last day. Yet they pushed forward knowing the message they carried could change the course of history. At this stage, you might be thinking, okay, codes and secret messages are cool. But this sounds a little too much like a James Bond movie. Well, you're not wrong, but as we'll see in the next section, the art of secret communication didn't always have to be about cryptic symbols or daring messages carried under cover of night. Sometimes the most effective secret communication was the one that no one ever noticed at all. Now let's talk about one of the simplest yet most brilliant methods of secret communication: invisible ink. I know it sounds like something out of an old spy novel, doesn't it? You're probably picturing a white-haired professor in a dusty library carefully scribing a message in some barely visible ink that only appears under ultraviolet light. Well, believe it or not, civilians during the German occupation didn't have fancy spy tech at their disposal, but they sure made do with what they had. Invisible ink was exactly that, a secret way of writing a message that wouldn't be visible to the naked eye. It's not magic, but it sure feels like it when you realize how these simple household materials could transform into tools of resistance. The most common ink wasn't some expensive liquid, but rather ingredients you could find right in your kitchen. Think lemon juice, milk, or even vinegar. All these substances could be used to create messages that would only appear when heated, usually over a candle or lamp. Historians still argue whether the most commonly used ink was lemon juice or the slightly more technical urine ink. Yep, you heard me right. Some resistance groups would actually use their own urine to create a barely visible, slightly acidic solution that worked like a charm. These simple materials weren't just convenient, they were also perfect for blending into everyday life. No one would suspect that your favorite glass of lemonade might be part of a covert operation. But here's where it gets really interesting. This wasn't just some write it and forget it process. It required finesse. For example, while lemon juice might be invisible to the naked eye, the message could be revealed with heat. However, there were ways to make the ink even more elusive. A common trick was to apply the invisible ink to a letter and then smear a layer of regular ink over it, making the paper look completely ordinary. Only the person with the correct technique, like the right heat source, could reveal the hidden message. Now, if you're thinking this sounds a bit too risky, you're not alone. In fact, resistance members had to take extreme precautions to avoid detection. Imagine trying to sneak around a house with a lit candle to reveal your secret message while avoiding the watchful eyes of soldiers.
Not exactly a peaceful evening, right? But people were willing to take these risks because the stakes were high. The messages contained vital information, ranging from escape routes to troop movements. Sometimes it was even something as simple as coordinating a safe meeting spot. In a world where the wrong word or slip up could cost you everything, these messages were worth their weight in gold.
But as clever as invisible ink was, it wasn't the only way to convey secrets without raising suspicion. The everyday objects in people's homes became tools for
espionage. Let's talk about bread for a second. Sounds strange, right? But during the war, bread was more than just a food. It was a vehicle for hidden communication. Imagine this. A loaf of bread might seem like a harmless everyday item, but in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, it became a perfect hiding spot for secret messages. The dough could be carefully shaped or marked in such a way that it looked completely ordinary on the outside, but once it was cut open, a small folded paper with vital information was hidden in the center. It was genius in its simplicity, and nobody would think twice about bread. Historians love to debate the practicality of using such an everyday object as a carrier for secret information. While some argue that the bread itself was too easily spotted, others believe it was one of the most effective methods because it was so mundane. It was a daily necessity. Even if someone was in the process of inspecting food, they wouldn't immediately think to look inside the bread. After all, who would even think of it? And it wasn't just bread. Everyday objects were often adapted for hidden communication. Newspapers, for instance, became a prime tool for covert messages. A seemingly ordinary article might have a code embedded within it, whether it was in the form of a subtle letter shift cipher or more cryptic clues that only a trained resistance member could decode. Imagine reading an article on the latest political events and thinking it was just another piece of propaganda, only to realize later that it was actually a life-saving message about a safe house. Now I know what you're thinking. Okay, so people were clever with invisible ink, but surely the Germans had some countermeasures for all this, right? Well, yes, they did. But the beauty of this whole covert communication system was that it relied on everyday non-suspicious activities. It wasn't just about finding new ways to hide messages. It was about making them so ordinary that even the most diligent German soldier would overlook them. And that, my friend, is the brilliance of civilian resistance. As we move through this narrative, it's clear that while people were creative, they also had to be incredibly cautious. Every method came with its own set of challenges and risks. Even the simplest messages had to be delivered in a way that wouldn't raise any suspicion. So you can see the world of secret communication wasn't just about cryptic writing or invisible ink. It was about how you could use the things around you to create a message and deliver it without anyone ever knowing it existed. These techniques might have seemed like the stuff of legends to some, but for the brave souls resisting the Nazi regime, it was the only way to survive. In our next section, we'll take a look at one of the most unique methods of communication, the tap code. Ever wondered how prisoners could communicate without speaking a word? Trust me, it's about to get even more interesting. All right, picture this. You're locked up in a cramped, dimly lit cell surrounded by stone walls and guards who never look away. Your freedom is gone, and yet you still have a way to communicate. Not through words, not through letters, but through sound. Specifically, a tap, a quiet, rhythmic series of knocks. That's right, this is the world of tap code, one of the most ingenious yet simple ways prisoners could communicate without ever opening their mouths. Tap code was a form of silent communication, a cipher that was designed for situations just like this, when speaking wasn't an option and writing was simply too risky. Developed by American soldiers during the Spanish-American War, it was later adopted by prisoners of war in World War II and beyond. The idea was simple, a system of knocking in a rhythm that could be understood by anyone who knew the code regardless of where they were in the prison. Essentially, it's a way of writing using sound instead of ink. The code itself is made up of a series of two numbers, one for the row, the other for the column, corresponding to letters of the alphabet. For example, if you wanted to say the letter C, you would tap 3 times, pause, and then tap one more time. A simple pattern, right? The beauty of it was that even if you were in separate cells, as long as you were within earshot, you could tap out messages to one another. Historians still argue whether the tap code was the most effective system for prisoners, or if more complex ciphers might have worked better in some cases. Some say that the simplicity of the tap code was its greatest strength. Its straightforwardness meant that it was easy to memorize and quick to execute. Others, however, argue that it could be easily intercepted by guards who were listening carefully enough, especially since it was a rather repetitive, rhythmic pattern. In reality, the success of tap code came down to one crucial factor: timing. If you were lucky enough to get your message through without alerting the guards, it worked wonders. Now, if you think tapping sounds a little too obvious to be effective, just wait until you hear about the lengths to which some prisoners would go to ensure their messages stayed hidden. For instance, if a prisoner knew that taps might be overheard, they would often disguise the noise by coordinating it with the everyday sounds of the prison environment. The rhythm of a broom sweeping, the rattle of a door, or the creaking of floorboards all could be used to mask the taps. Clever, right? In essence, prisoners had to make their communication blend in with the noise around them so that they wouldn't raise suspicion. But tap code wasn't just confined to prison cells. This communication method found its way into other covert operations as well. For example, resistance groups used it in occupied countries, tapping on walls or doors to communicate with one another. The beauty of it was that you didn't need a fancy setup, you just needed someone else to be within earshot. If you could tap out your message without anyone noticing, you had an instant line of communication. It was like turning the walls themselves into a type of communication medium. And it wasn't just prisoners who relied on this clever system. In the field, resistance fighters would sometimes use tap codes to relay vital messages to other members of their group. Imagine crouching behind a pile of rubble in the dead of night, tapping out coordinates or mission orders to a fellow fighter just a few feet away. The simplicity and speed of the code made it an invaluable tool in situations where every second counted. But just like all methods of covert communication, tap code had its drawbacks. One major limitation was the potential for confusion. Given that there were only 26 letters in the alphabet, but 30 possible combinations of row and column numbers using a 5 by 5 grid. Certain letters were sometimes doubled up. For example, the letters C and K would both be represented by the same code 3-1. This meant that when spelling words, you'd have to rely on context to determine which letter was intended. It wasn't a perfect system, but when you're trying to send messages under the nose of enemy guards, perfection isn't always the goal, survival is.
Despite these small imperfections, tap code was an incredibly effective way for prisoners and resistance fighters alike to communicate in a way that was hard to detect and even harder to decode. It was the perfect example of how necessity breeds innovation. In situations where you've got no choice but to get creative, even something as simple as a few taps on a wall can make the difference between life and death.
Now, while tap code is all well and good, it was far from the only method available to those trying to communicate secretly. In the next section, we'll shift gears a bit and dive into something even more everyday, the objects you carry with you. You wouldn't think that something as innocent as a loaf of bread could become a vessel for life saving messages, but that's exactly what we'll explore next. Stay tuned. Now, let's get back to something that may seem incredibly mundane everyday objects. When you think about secret communication, you might imagine high tech gadgets or highly trained spies using encrypted messages. But the truth is, civilians under German occupation had to get really creative, and sometimes the most effective tools were the ones that no one would ever suspect. Let's talk about bread. Yes, bread. That humble loaf you might pick up from the local bakery. It became a secret messenger during the war. So, how does bread fit into secret communication? Well, in occupied Europe, where resistance fighters were constantly under threat, anything that could pass through enemy checkpoints unnoticed was a gold mine. People became masters of concealing information in the most unlikely of places. Breads, pastries, and cakes were all used to hide secret messages. The idea was simple: fold a small encrypted message inside the dough. Once baked, the bread would look completely normal on the outside, but with a careful hand, you could slice through it, revealing the message hidden inside. Historians still argue about how widely this technique was used, given that bread is, after all, quite perishable and would certainly raise suspicion if it was handled unusually. But even so, it was a low-risk, low-tech method that worked in a pinch, especially if you had the right allies in the right places. The bread could be passed along by couriers who were often unaware of the contents, making it a safer choice compared to more obvious forms of communication.
Another fascinating method was using something as ordinary as a book. Resistance groups often used literature, whether it was novels, pamphlets, or even school textbooks, to communicate secret messages. It wasn't just about the content of the book, though, it was about what was hidden within it. Messages were often encoded in the margins between the lines, or even under the cover. If you were in the know, you would carefully inspect the book for signs of tampering or hidden messages. Take, for example, a book that was being passed among the resistance. The person who received it might flip through its pages until they reached a chapter with peculiar notations in the margins, words that didn't belong there. Or perhaps there was a code hidden in the number of words on a specific page or paragraph. It was a kind of secret reader's language where the content itself remained innocuous,
but the person who knew how to read between the lines could extract crucial intelligence. One particularly interesting technique involved a code called the book cipher. A typical book cipher might use a set of numbers that referred to specific letters in a book. For example, a message might read, page 48, line 3, word 7. That means the person would flip to page 48, find the third line, and then extract the seventh word on that line. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly effective when used correctly, and like the bread method, it would be nearly impossible for a German soldier to detect.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. This wasn't just about hiding messages. Resistance groups also had to use ordinary items to signal one another. One particularly clever method involved the subtle use of signs in the environment, like arranging items on a table or adjusting the placement of an object in plain sight to signal a message. This could be as simple as moving a chair slightly to the left to indicate a meeting spot, or placing a piece of fruit in a certain way to signal that a covert message was coming through. These types of visual cues were incredibly subtle, and unless you were specifically trained to recognize them, they would pass unnoticed.
Historians still argue about the effectiveness of these everyday methods of communication, especially considering how easy it would be to make a mistake. For example, could a loaf of bread truly survive a rigorous inspection without being noticed? Or what about a book cipher? How easy was it for the enemy to spot that a particular book was being used in an unusual way? While it's easy to imagine these techniques as being unreliable or prone to error, they were part of a broader web of secret communications that worked together to keep resistance efforts alive.
But let's not forget these weren't just civilian efforts. Resistance groups often working alongside local networks and even military units developed entire systems for encoding and passing messages. For example, resistance fighters would sometimes hide messages inside everyday objects like the handles of suitcases, the soles of shoes, or even inside the stitching of clothing. Each item might serve as a kind of dead drop where a crucial message could be hidden for someone else to pick up and deliver. What made this strategy particularly effective was that these objects were already being carried through enemy territory on a daily basis, making it much harder for the Germans to track or intercept them. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects of this kind of communication was how it operated in parallel with what we'd consider normal life. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly ordinary. People were going about their daily routines, eating bread, reading books, and talking to one another in public. But beneath that calm exterior, messages were being passed, connections were being made, and lives were being saved, all without a word being spoken.
In the next section, we'll explore a form of communication that at first glance seems completely unrelated to secret messages pigeons. Yes, pigeons. These seemingly ordinary birds played a crucial role in resistance operations, and you'd be surprised at how they helped carry messages that were too important to be sent by any other means. Stay with me because it's about to get even more fascinating. All right, now, let's take a little detour into the skies. Picture this: a war-torn country occupied by enemy forces where communication is a matter of life and death. You'd think that in a world where even the most basic forms of communication are tightly controlled, the humble pigeon wouldn't stand a chance.
But surprisingly, these birds were more than just flying rats. During the war, they became some of the most important messengers for resistance groups carrying vital messages across enemy lines and through dangerous terrain.
Yes, pigeons, these feathered couriers became an essential part of secret communication.
The use of pigeons to carry messages dates back long before World War II, but during the war, the technique was refined and elevated to an art form. Resistance groups, particularly in France, relied on homing pigeons to carry messages between safe houses, military units, and underground networks. These pigeons had one special talent: they could find their way home from nearly any location, no matter how far they'd been taken. That's because homing pigeons have an incredible navigational ability. They can fly hundreds of miles, always returning to the place they were raised. This made them the perfect choice for secret communication, especially in areas where it was difficult or dangerous to send messages by land or sea.
Now I know what you're thinking. Why not just use radios or telephones? Well, while radios and telephones could indeed carry messages, they also carried the risk of interception. A radio transmission could be picked up by the enemy and a phone call could be traced. But pigeons, well, pigeons couldn't be hacked. They were completely immune to electronic surveillance, making them a safer bet for those who needed to communicate without being detected.
Historians still argue whether pigeons were the most reliable form of communication in wartime, or if they were just a convenient tool in specific situations. Some suggest that pigeons were highly effective, especially in mountainous regions or places where the enemy had severed other communication routes. Others claim that pigeons weren't without their flaws. For instance, pigeons could sometimes get lost, or they could be intercepted by enemy hunters or trained falcons. But despite these occasional setbacks, pigeons played a crucial role in the network of secret communication that kept the resistance alive.
One of the most famous examples of pigeon heroism came during the D-Day invasion of Normandy. On that day, a pigeon named G.I. Joe flew through a hail of gunfire and dodged enemy forces to deliver a vital message about an attack delay, saving the lives of countless soldiers. G.I. Joe's heroic flight earned him a medal for his bravery, and he became one of the most celebrated pigeons in history. His story is just one example of how these birds were trusted with the kinds of high stakes messages that could make or break an entire operation. But how exactly did this pigeon based communication work? Well, pigeons were trained to fly from a specific location back to their home loft. Resistance groups would attach a small message to the bird's leg, usually a tiny, lightweight capsule containing a written note. The bird would then be released and would fly home, where the recipient would remove the message and act on the information. It was a simple but effective system that required little more than a trusted pigeon, a trained handler, and the ability to send messages without leaving a trace.
Resistance groups went to great lengths to ensure the pigeons were well taken care of. These birds were often given specialized homes, pigeon lofts that were kept hidden in safe houses or underground bunkers. Some pigeons even had their own identification tags, allowing them to be tracked or assigned to specific locations. These lofts were crucial because the pigeons needed to be in good health and ready to fly at a moment's notice. After all, the stakes were high and there was no room for failure.
One fascinating aspect of pigeon communication was how it operated alongside other covert methods. Imagine this scenario. You're a resistance fighter and you've just received a coded message in a loaf of bread. Yes, the same method we discussed earlier. You now need to get that information to your allies in another city. The safest way to do this might be to attach a written note to a pigeon and send it off.
While you wait for the pigeon to return with a response, you might also be relying on a more traditional communication methods like coded letters or clandestine meetings in hidden locations. In this way, pigeons were just one part of a complex, multi-layered network of communication that kept resistance movements connected and alive.
But there was an interesting debate among historians about whether pigeons were actually more reliable than other forms of communication. Some argue that pigeons, despite their potential for failure, were incredibly dependable because they didn't rely on human intervention. Once the bird was trained, it could be sent on its mission without any need for direct human involvement. Others argue that pigeons were more vulnerable to attack either from enemy soldiers or birds of prey, which could intercept or kill them. And let's not forget about the weather. It wasn't always easy for pigeons to fly in storms or unfavorable conditions.
Still, pigeons remained a preferred method of communication for many resistance groups, especially in places where no other options were available. The combination of secrecy, reliability, and speed made pigeons an invaluable tool for those working behind enemy lines. Plus, they were surprisingly hard to track. The Germans, for example, tried to counteract the use of pigeons by employing trained falcons, but this only led to an ongoing battle between resistance groups and their avian interceptors. It was a strange and unexpected form of warfare bird against bird, but it worked.
So next time you see a pigeon in the park or a flock flying overhead, remember the role they played in keeping the fight for freedom alive. These unassuming creatures were a lifeline for countless resistance fighters, making journeys through enemy territory that no human could have undertaken without great risk. In the next section, we'll take a closer look at how even the simplest forms of hidden messaging, like leaving notes in everyday places, could make a huge difference in a world that was constantly under surveillance.
Words to count 101. Now that we've covered pigeons, let's take a step back into the streets of occupied Europe. It's hard to imagine, but even in the most heavily policed cities, there were still ways to communicate without ever uttering a word or writing a letter. One of the most creative methods for getting secret messages from point A to point B was through the use of dead drops. And no, this isn't as spooky as it sounds, though it definitely had an air of mystery about it.
Dead drops, for those who aren't familiar, are essentially places where someone can leave a message and someone else can pick it up without either of them having to meet face to face. Imagine you're walking down the street and pass by a tree. Hidden beneath the roots or tucked into the hollow of a branch is a tiny container holding an important message. You walk by casually dropping a small piece of paper into the hollow, and later your contact arrives, picks it up, and reads it. No faces, no conversations, just silent communication. It's genius, really. It's like a scavenger hunt, except the clues you're leaving are life or death instructions. And to make sure you didn't just leave an obvious trail for the enemy to follow. The locations of these dead drops were often chosen for their complete inconspicuousness. Under a loose stone between the cracks in a wall or behind a slightly displaced brick. These were the sorts of places where secret messages would find their way into the hands of resistance fighters. It was the perfect way to keep your operations under the radar.
But here's the thing, dead drops were not without their risks. For one, they could be accidentally discovered by anyone, whether a soldier or a civilian, which is why they had to be placed with extreme care. If you were caught retrieving a message from a dead drop, well, that could mean certain death. So, how did these individuals do it without getting caught? Simple, these secret locations weren't just random. They were part of an intricate network that the resistance had developed. They were strategically placed so that only the people who knew the map could use them.
Some of these dead drops were ingeniously hidden in public spaces, places so ordinary that no one would ever think to look twice. Take, for example, a simple park bench. To the untrained eye, it's just a place to sit and rest. But to the resistance, it might be a vital exchange point. A note would be left under the bench, wedged carefully between the slats. Someone would arrive hours later, take a seat, and casually retrieve the note without ever drawing attention. If a soldier or a civilian wandered past, they'd see nothing unusual, just a man resting in the park enjoying the day.
Dead drops weren't confined to city streets. In rural areas, they were often placed in more natural locations. A field, for example, might be the perfect setting for a dead drop, where a well-disguised location like a tree stump or under a pile of stones became a temporary storage for vital information. The beauty of these rural dead drops was that they were often outside the normal flow of traffic, making it less likely for someone to stumble upon them by accident.
But how did the resistance fighters know where to go? Simple, the same system that had been developed for pigeon communication often extended to the dead drops. There were maps of locations that were shared through underground networks. A resistance member could know that a specific tree was used for dropping messages on a particular day, and that the next drop would be made at a different location. These locations weren't shared lightly, and the drop-off points would often change to prevent them from becoming compromised. Some experts believe that these networks were far more intricate than we can imagine, relying on sophisticated signaling systems and trusted couriers to relay the message of when and where the next dead drop would take place.
In some ways, dead drops are a lost art. They require not just a bit of secrecy, but an intricate knowledge of one's surroundings. The idea that an entire network of resistance fighters could rely on these drop points without ever speaking a word to each other is nothing short of fascinating. Yet this method was so effective that in many cases it allowed the resistance to function without being noticed. And remember, it wasn't just about leaving messages. Sometimes it was about dropping something else entirely. For instance, a stash of weapons, ammunition, or supplies might be hidden in plain sight. The location of these drop points wasn't just about communication, it was about survival.
Historians still debate the exact number of dead drops that were used during the war. Some claim that these systems were far more widespread than we know, with hundreds of drops scattered across major cities and rural areas. Others argue that the network of dead drops was far more localized and operated only within specific resistance cells. But one thing is certain, it was a vital part of the communication system, one that was used across the occupied territories of Europe.
The beauty of these dead drops and why they're so fascinating is that they represent the ultimate in low tech, low risk communication. While many resistance movements relied on radios, code breakers, or even couriers, the dead drop had none of those risks. There was no transmission that could be intercepted, no code that could be broken, no physical meeting to be observed. It was just a person leaving a message for another to retrieve, and it worked because it blended so seamlessly into everyday life. You might walk by a dead drop 100 times without ever knowing it. Next section. We'll explore how even the smallest and most subtle things like the placement of a button, the stitch of a sleeve could be used to communicate. It's all about seeing the world through a different lens. And in occupied Europe, even the simplest object could carry the weight of secret knowledge. Let's take a moment to talk about something we often overlook in our daily lives clothing. You might think that a jacket, a hat, or a pair of shoes wouldn't be anything special. But during the occupation of Europe, these ordinary items became a covert method of secret communication, transforming everyday wear into a carrier of hidden messages. It wasn't just about fashion, it was about survival. Clothes became a medium for encoding messages in ways that would never raise suspicion.
The concept is simple enough. Imagine you're walking through a crowd trying to keep a low profile. The last thing you'd want is to be caught with a letter, a map, or a radio transmitter that could easily be intercepted. So, what do? You send a message through your clothing, a piece of fabric sewn into a lining, a button stitched at an odd angle, or even a certain pattern in the weave of a scarf. All of these could contain encoded information. A seemingly innocent gesture like adjusting your sleeve or tugging at the edge of a coat could be a signal to someone in the know.
Historians still debate the effectiveness of clothing as a communication tool. Some argue that it was a brilliant way to pass messages without raising suspicion. After all, everyone wears clothes, and unless you're specifically trained to look for hidden codes, you'd never think twice about the way a shirt was buttoned or the length of a scarf. Others, however, suggest that this method might have been far riskier than it seemed. If an enemy soldier saw someone adjusting their clothes in a peculiar way or acting out of the ordinary, it could immediately arouse suspicion. But that's the beauty of it. Resistance fighters had to be so well trained and so discreet that even the smallest gesture wouldn't be noticed.
One of the most fascinating examples of this technique involved hidden messages sewn into the seams or linings of jackets. Resistance fighters would take the time to carefully sew tiny messages into their clothing. These messages could include vital instructions or dates for future meetings, and they were often concealed in ways that would only be discovered by those with the know-how. A small piece of paper might be sewn into the lining of a coat, or a coded word could be embedded within the pattern of the fabric. If you were lucky enough to know the code, you could use these seemingly innocent articles of clothing to deliver a critical message.
Buttons were another clever tool in the world of secret clothing communication. A button might seem like a small, insignificant detail, but to those who were in the know, buttons could carry vital information. A button placed in an unusual position or a mismatched button could be a coded signal. The placement of buttons, or the type of thread used to sew them on none, could indicate specific locations or dates for a clandestine meeting.
You might wonder how something as simple as a button could be used for secret communication. Well, let's say you're meeting a contact in a busy cafe. You don't want to risk handing over a letter or making eye contact, so instead you subtly tug at your coat's collar or adjust your shirt. Your contact who knows what to look for sees the tiny detail, the button that's slightly off center, and understands that you need to meet at a certain location or that a message is waiting. These seemingly innocuous details became part of a silent language, one that allowed resistance members to pass on vital information without ever saying a word.
One of the quirkiest examples of hidden communication through clothing was the use of embroidery. In some cases, resistance groups would use needle and thread to sew secret symbols or messages into the fabric of clothing. For instance, a simple pattern on a piece of clothing might seem like just an ordinary design, but to those who knew how to interpret it, it could represent a coded message. Certain stitches or designs might point to a specific safe house or indicate that a particular operation was in progress. Embroidery in this sense wasn't just an art form, it was a tool of resistance. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. These methods weren't limited to clothing. Other personal items like bags, hats, or scarves could be used in similar ways. A scarf might be folded in a specific manner to signal that a courier was coming with important information. A hat might be adjusted in a certain way to indicate a meeting time. It's not that people were being paranoid, they were simply trying to survive in a world where even the smallest action could be scrutinized.
The true genius behind these methods of communication lies in their invisibility. After all, who would suspect a button to be anything more than a button?
Or a scarf to be anything more than a scarf. Resistance fighters relied on the everyday nature of these objects to ensure that they went unnoticed by the enemy. These subtle, almost imperceptible forms of communication were perfect for operating under the radar.
Historians argue whether the clothing method of communication was as widespread as some other techniques such as dead drops or pigeons, but it is clear that it played a crucial role in maintaining the secrecy of resistance movements. These methods of hidden communication allowed civilians to pass along critical information without ever attracting the attention of the enemy. And while it may seem like something out of a spy movie, the reality is that these methods were a lifeline for many living under occupation.
In the next section, we'll dive into something a little more upbeat, though still crucial to the communication efforts of the resistance music. It might sound strange, but music became one of the most powerful forms of secret communication during the war. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for this one. Now imagine a world where the sound of a melody, the beat of a drum, or the lyrics of a song could mean life or death. No, this isn't some abstract concept during World War II. Music became one of the most effective and subtle forms of secret communication, and the resistance used it to their advantage in incredible ways. Whether it was in a concert hall, a tavern, or on the street, music offered a unique opportunity to communicate covertly and inspire resistance without raising any suspicion. The power of music, after all, lies not only in its melody, but in its ability to convey meaning in ways that words alone cannot. For starters, let's think about how music could be used in everyday settings. In a cafe or at a party, music was an integral part of life, something that could easily blend into the background.
But for those in the resistance, a seemingly innocent tune could hold coded messages. You might think, how could anyone ever notice? Well, it wasn't about the song itself, but about the subtle cues that could be hidden within it. A shift in rhythm, a particular arrangement of notes, or even the choice of song could carry vital information for those who were trained to listen for it.
Imagine being at a resistance meeting where the plan for the next day's operation is hidden in plain sight. The leader of the group might sing a particular song, but with a slight change in timing or inflection, just enough to signal to the others that something is wrong or that a change in plans is imminent. Think of it as a musical cipher. The beauty of it was that no one would notice unless they were listening closely enough to understand the cues hidden within the music. Historians still argue whether this was as common a practice as other methods such as coded letters or radio signals. Some believe that it was a widespread form of communication, especially in places like France, where cafes and music halls were prime locations for underground gatherings. Others contend that it was more of a fringe technique used sparingly but incredibly effective when employed. In either case, it's clear that music had the power to unite resistance fighters in ways that words alone couldn't.
One of the most fascinating aspects of music as a method of communication was its ability to inspire and energize the population. In occupied territories, the Nazis banned or censored much of the popular music, particularly songs that had any political or subversive undertones. But this didn't stop the resistance. Instead, they used the same songs the Nazis tried to suppress to send coded messages. Lyrics were altered, subtly creating new meanings while still remaining familiar enough to resonate with the listener. Take, for example, the use of folk songs. These tunes, passed down through generations, were deeply ingrained in the culture of the people. Resistance members would often
Use these songs to convey secret messages. A line in a folk song that spoke of freedom might be twisted just enough to give it a double meaning, one understood by the resistance and one that passed unnoticed by the occupiers. Music became not just a medium for communication, but also a source of morale. For civilians living under the oppression of Nazi rule, hearing their own national songs sung in public, albeit altered and hidden, was a form of rebellion in itself.
Some resistance movements even set up clandestine radio stations broadcasting songs that seemed perfectly innocent on the surface but contained hidden messages. These pirate radio stations became vital lifelines for the underground broadcasting, not only news and information, but also songs that carried covert instructions. The lyrics might not mention anything overtly political, but the timing, the music's tempo, or the choice of specific songs could indicate the need to act or signal a change in plans. The debate continues among historians as to whether these musical broadcasts were widely heard, given that many people still relied on traditional means of communication like coded letters or secret meetings. However, what's certain is that they were incredibly important in maintaining morale and providing a sense of unity. The resistance fighters who risked everything to create and listen to these broadcasts knew that every word, every note could carry meaning far beyond the music itself. But the use of music wasn't confined to clandestine radio stations or coded folk songs. Music could also be used as a signal in the most public of spaces. Resistance fighters,
would sometimes use certain songs as a way to communicate directly with each other, even in crowded squares or marketplaces. A particular tune might be played or hummed in passing to let someone know that a meeting time or place had changed, or to signal that a message was waiting to be picked up. A quick whistle, a chorus hummed under the breath. These small musical cues were woven into the fabric of everyday life, making them hard to detect by the enemy.
This form of secret communication through music wasn't just confined to the resistance. Many civilians aware of the dangers around them would use the same techniques to discreetly convey messages to one another. A well-timed song played in the background could reveal where the next resistance meeting was taking place, or it might be a way of telling someone that the coast was clear and they could proceed with their mission.
The beauty of music as a tool for covert communication was its simplicity and subtlety. The Nazis couldn't exactly ban or monitor every public performance of a folk song or every tune that was hummed on the street. Music had the power to bring people together in ways that words alone could not, and it gave the resistance a method of communication that was both covert and uplifting. In the next section, we'll move from the artistic and emotional power of music to something far more technical, the telephone line. It might sound mundane, but for those in the resistance, even something as ordinary as a phone call could be twisted into a tool of secret communication if you knew how to use it. You won't want to miss it. Now let's take a deep dive into something that at first glance might seem a little too ordinary to be part of secret communications. The telephone. Sounds a little mundane, right? But bear with me, during World War II and particularly under Nazi occupation, even something as seemingly simple as a phone call could become an essential tool for resistance fighters looking to communicate secretly. It wasn't just about picking up the receiver and dialing. It was about misdirection, clever tactics, and of course, playing the game of telephone without getting caught.
Imagine this scenario. You're living under Nazi rule and you have to get an important message to a fellow resistance fighter. But every phone line is monitored and every conversation is at risk of being intercepted. How do you get around that? Well, one common method was to turn the phone call into a decoy. Rather than directly discussing the sensitive information you needed to pass, you'd engage in a seemingly innocent conversation using misdirection to keep the enemy from suspecting that something more important was going on behind the lines.
It worked like this. The resistance fighter on the other end of the line might pick up the phone only to hear a casual conversation about the weather family or some other inconsequential topic. But hidden in that conversation between the lines were the real message's coded phrases, seemingly trivial comments that had a very specific meaning for those in the know. The real message wasn't in what was being said directly, but in the way it was said. A seemingly random comment about the weather might be a way to indicate a safe house, or a seemingly innocent mention of a location could actually be a signal that a shipment is coming. Historians still argue whether these telephone decoy methods were widely used, or if they were just one tactic among many in the larger strategy of resistance communication. Some suggest that it was a common method, especially in urban areas where resistance cells needed to maintain constant contact. Others argue that it was more of a niche technique, too risky to be used widely. After all, phone calls could still be intercepted, and even a slight mistake in tone or timing could reveal the true purpose of the call. But that's where misdirection came in. Resistance fighters often had to engage in conversations that seemed totally innocent to anyone overhearing them. If someone on the other end of the line responded to a coded message without questioning it, that would be the signal that the conversation was going according to plan. However, if a misstep happened, if the wrong tone was used, or if an overly suspicious comment was made, that could spell disaster. It wasn't just about the content of the conversation either. Sometimes resistance members would employ more technical tricks to keep the call under the radar. For example, some resistance fighters would intentionally keep their conversations short, only using enough time to pass along a few words of information. The brevity made it less likely that the call would be overheard or suspected. Even the act of making a call could itself be part of the misdirection. For instance, a resistance member might make a seemingly random call to a number only to hang up quickly, knowing that it would confuse any potential eavesdropper listening in on the line. A wrong number dialed on purpose could serve as a decoy to distract the enemy. The telephone line wasn't just used for one-on-one conversations. Sometimes larger underground networks would use phone calls as a form of coordination for larger operations. For example, a resistance fighter in one part of the city might call another in a completely different area to inform them that a shipment of weapons was coming through or that an evacuation route was clear. These calls were often designed to be as brief and to the point as possible, using a language that wouldn't make sense to anyone listening in. But for those who understood the code, they were an essential part of staying connected and coordinating efforts across various resistance cells.
Still, these calls were incredibly risky. Anyone listening to the line could easily catch on to the fact that something suspicious was going on if the conversation wasn't conducted carefully. And the Germans were well aware of the risks of covert telephone communications. They had their own methods of intercepting and deciphering these calls. The German authorities would routinely monitor phone lines, hoping to catch resistance fighters in the act of transmitting secret messages. So while the telephone was a useful tool for communication, it also required constant vigilance and a keen understanding of how to avoid detection. Resistance networks understood this risk and adapted accordingly. Some calls were placed through relays using multiple phone lines to obscure the origin of the message. For instance, a person might call a friend who would then call a third party who would ultimately relay the message to the intended recipient. This method made it far more difficult for the enemy to trace the message back to its source. Additionally, there was always the possibility of using payphones or public telephones, which, while risky, offered an added layer of anonymity when it came to phone communication. One of the more interesting techniques involved using coded language. Much like the tap codes we discussed earlier, a phone conversation could be disguised with strange or seemingly irrelevant phrases. For example, instead of saying the meeting is at the old warehouse, a fighter might say, "I'll meet you by the new bakery at noon," with bakery referring to the warehouse and noon being a signal for the meeting time. These kinds of codes worked because while the words might seem normal on the surface, they were only decipherable by those who knew the key. In addition to personal calls, resistance groups also used phone lines to relay instructions to larger groups of people. For example, an underground press might receive a coded phone call with the details of the next edition's distribution points.
A radio operator might receive a call giving them the green light to start broadcasting a secret message. Though these methods were risky, they were part of a larger web of secret communication techniques that allowed resistance fighters to stay one step ahead of the occupiers.
In the next section, we'll look at how ordinary people who might never have imagined playing a role in espionage became the unsung couriers of vital messages. From postmen to shopkeepers, these everyday heroes risked everything to get secret information into the right hands. Stay with me because the story is just getting started. Now that we've covered the subtle world of telephone communication, let's zoom out for a second and consider the bigger picture: the couriers. They were in many ways the lifeblood of the underground networks that kept the resistance alive. You might imagine a courier as some mysterious figure cloaked in shadow, dashing from one secret meeting to the next. But in reality, the couriers were often just ordinary people: teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, or even children who risked everything to deliver messages, documents, and even weapons through enemy lines. They were the unsung heroes of the resistance, and without them, many of the covert communication methods we've discussed would have been useless. Take a moment to think about it. Moving secret messages around under the nose of the German occupiers wasn't easy. You couldn't just send an email or text, nor could you make an obvious phone call. You had to rely on face-to-face exchanges, often in crowded public spaces where any misstep could lead to exposure. And that's where couriers came in. They were the ones who physically moved the messages, passed along instructions, or delivered life-saving supplies, all while keeping their identities and missions hidden. One of the fascinating things about these couriers is that many of them were just everyday people who had no previous training in espionage. They weren't spies or military operatives. In fact, most of the couriers were chosen precisely because they were inconspicuous people who could blend into everyday life without drawing attention. They weren't running around in trench coats or dark sunglasses. They were often just normal individuals who had the courage to carry out dangerous missions. These couriers would typically use a variety of methods to disguise the contents of their deliveries. Often the messages were hidden in plain sight inside books, under the soles of shoes, or tucked away in hollowed-out objects. Sometimes messages would be sewn into the lining of a coat or hidden beneath the flap of a hat. On other occasions, couriers would carry simple, everyday objects that had secret compartments built into them. These items were often made in such a way that they looked completely ordinary to a casual observer. But for those in the know, they were perfect for transporting sensitive information. The danger these couriers faced was immense. The stakes were high, and one mistake could mean exposure, arrest, or worse. And yet these individuals were willing to risk everything to pass on a message or deliver a piece of intelligence. You might think they were paid handsomely for their work, but in most cases they weren't. Many couriers were simply driven by a sense of duty, loyalty, or a desire to help in the fight against the occupation. They were putting their lives on the line, knowing that failure meant not only their own death, but the potential end of an entire operation. In many ways, the role of the courier was similar to that of a trusted messenger. The difference was that the couriers were doing this in secret, operating under constant threat of discovery.
It wasn't uncommon for couriers to have to hide in plain sight, walking through checkpoints or interacting with soldiers without giving any sign that they were anything other than ordinary civilians. Sometimes couriers had to rely on disguises or fake identities, carrying forged documents that allowed them to pass through occupied areas without suspicion.
But the real challenge for these couriers wasn't necessarily the act of delivering a message, it was the constant threat of betrayal. For every loyal courier, there was the potential for someone to be caught and coerced into giving up names and contacts. A courier's success depended not only on their ability to hide the message, but also on their ability to trust others. Resistance networks were tightly knit communities, and one leak could mean the end of everything. So couriers had to be discerning, careful in who they trusted and how they communicated. One particularly memorable example of a courier's bravery came during the D-Day invasion. As part of the larger resistance effort, couriers worked tirelessly to deliver important messages about troop movements and timing. One courier, a young woman, was tasked with delivering a critical message about an impending airborne assault. She had to move through a heavily patrolled area, dodging soldiers and using dead drops along the way. When she was caught, she refused to reveal any details about her mission, even under the most intense interrogation. Her resilience helped ensure that the invasion went forward as planned, and she became a symbol of the courage and determination that couriers embodied.
While we often think of the couriers as isolated lone wolves, they were actually part of a larger web of communication that connected resistance groups across Europe.
This network was made up of thousands of people working together, often unaware of each other's identities, but all playing their part in a greater mission. The couriers were the ones who made that network functional. Without them, all the codes, ciphers, and dead drops in the world would have been useless. The couriers brought the messages to life. They were the ones who ensured that vital information made it from one group to another, no matter the obstacles in their way. It's important to note that while couriers were often individuals working for the resistance, some were also members of more formal organizations. Military resistance groups had established courier systems that were specifically designed to move messages and supplies efficiently across enemy lines. In many cases, these couriers were highly trained in evasion tactics, disguises, and how to avoid detection by German forces. However, even among these groups, the risk of exposure was ever present. Being a courier was not a glamorous role, it was a dangerous one.
In the next section, we'll shift our focus to another fascinating aspect of secret communication, the underground press. These clandestine newspapers and pamphlets played an essential role in keeping resistance fighters informed and coordinated while under constant surveillance. Stay tuned. It's about to get even more interesting. Now that we've explored the life-risking work of couriers, let's turn our attention to one of the most important forms of communication used by resistance fighters, the underground press. You might think of a newspaper as just another way to pass the time, but during wartime, especially under German occupation, the underground press was much more than that. It was a lifeline. These clandestine newspapers, pamphlets, and leaflets were a vital source of information for civilians and resistance groups alike, providing not just news, but guidance, hope, and an essential network of communication.
Imagine this the daily grind of living under Nazi rule, where every word you speak, every action you take could be scrutinized. The radio stations were controlled. The newspapers were full of propaganda, and communication was tightly monitored. In such an oppressive environment, the underground press became one of the few ways for people to get unfiltered news exchange messages and coordinate resistance activities. But these publications weren't like any other. They had to be secret, distributed covertly, and designed to fly under the radar of German authorities.
Historians still debate the extent to which underground newspapers were successful in their mission. Some argue that these publications played a crucial role in the resistance movement, not just by providing vital information, but also by helping to maintain morale and a sense of unity among the population. Others suggest that their impact was somewhat limited as they were produced in secret and often had to rely on a network of couriers to distribute them, making them vulnerable to detection. Nevertheless, these clandestine presses represented one of the most innovative ways of communicating secretly during the war.
The underground press wasn't just about passing along information, it was also about sending coded messages. Just as resistance fighters used hidden ink or dead drops, they would also encode messages in the articles of these publications. For example, a simple article about a political event could contain a subtle coded instruction about a meeting time or location. Or perhaps a seemingly innocent story about a local business would actually be a message about a safe house, a change in plans, or an attack on German forces. In these cases, the message wasn't about what was written, but about how it was written.
One of the most famous underground newspapers in Nazi-occupied France was Le Combat. It wasn't just an ordinary newspaper, it was a beacon of defiance created by resistance fighters who risked their lives to publish it. Le Combat became a vital source of information, sending out reports that were not only accurate but also designed to inspire the population to resist. The paper was distributed secretly, and its editors worked in the shadows printing their issues on secret presses. The process was highly dangerous. If they were caught, the consequences would have been fatal.
But creating these underground publications wasn't easy. Most resistance groups had to set up secret printing presses in basements or hidden locations. These presses were often small, makeshift operations with minimal equipment, which made it incredibly difficult to produce large volumes of material. In some cases, the presses were hidden in plain sight, perhaps posing as a legitimate business like a bookstore or a print shop. In other cases, they were set up in abandoned buildings or underground bunkers. Every page printed was a potential death sentence if discovered. But still the work went on and the underground press persisted in spreading vital information. The distribution of these papers was another major challenge. Couriers had to carry them through German-controlled areas, often risking their lives to get them to
The
the
right people. These papers were sometimes left in public places like under a park bench, inside a phone booth, or hidden in a stack of newspapers at the local shop. Sometimes they were handed out directly by couriers who would risk being caught just to get a message into the hands of a fellow resistance member. If the authorities got wind of the distribution network, they would immediately crack down on it, making it even more dangerous for those involved. And in some cases, these underground publications were not just for the resistance, they were also used to gather support among the civilian population.
The editors and writers of these papers knew that simply printing propaganda wasn't enough. They needed to inspire people to take action, to stand up to the occupation, and fight back in whatever way they could. The press played a key role in shaping public opinion, helping to maintain morale and hope even when the situation seemed hopeless.
It wasn't just about inspiring hope, it was also about spreading critical news. The Nazis controlled the major news outlets, filling the airwaves and the pages of their newspapers with lies, distortions, and propaganda. The underground press countered this with unfiltered real information, including reports on military movements, updates on the whereabouts of key resistance members, and news of Allies' successes. In many ways, these underground newspapers kept the fire of resistance burning, ensuring that the occupiers couldn't completely control the narratives.
What makes these underground presses so fascinating and so critical to the resistance is that they were often created by people who weren't trained journalists. In fact, most of the writers, editors, and printers were ordinary civilians. Teachers, students, shopkeepers, and office workers. People from all walks of life became part of this underground movement. They took on roles as writers, editors, printers, and distributors, all the while knowing the incredible risks they were taking. And yet, these everyday people were the ones who helped keep the spark of rebellion alive. We'll explore a different but equally effective form of covert communication stenography. Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with anything.
But trust me, it's an art that allowed resistance members to hide messages right in front of the enemy's eyes. It's about to get really intriguing, so don't go anywhere. Now that we've seen how the underground press played a critical role in keeping resistance movements informed, let's dive into something that might seem a little less flashy, but was equally important: stenography. I know what you're probably thinking. Stenography, isn't that just shorthand for writing fast? Well, yes, it is shorthand, but it's also a powerful tool for encoding messages in plain sight. And during World War II, it became a secret weapon for those in the resistance. It's not just about writing quickly, it's about hiding important information in a way that the enemy couldn't decipher.
Imagine this: you're sitting at a desk, a piece of paper in front of you, and you're writing. But what you're writing isn't meant to be read by just anyone. In fact, only a select few people could actually understand what you were putting down on that page. To the untrained eye, it's just a jumble of squiggly lines, a mass of shorthand symbols that look completely nonsensical. But for those who knew how to read it, it was a full, detailed message. This was stenography, the art of using symbols, shorthand, and encoded writing to convey secret information without anyone else being able to understand it.
Historians still argue how widely stenography was used during the war, as it wasn't as commonly known or practiced as some other covert techniques.
However, for the resistance, it was an invaluable method for passing along messages. Why? Because at its core, stenography allows for writing that looks entirely innocent to the naked eye but still carries a hidden meaning. For example, a resistance member could take a routine note, perhaps a grocery list or an innocuous letter to a family member, and slip vital information into it by using a stenographic code. To anyone unfamiliar with the shorthand, it would just look like everyday writing.
But for the resistance, it was a perfect way to send crucial details without being detected. Now, let's look at the mechanics of it. Stenography uses a set of symbols or shorthand that represents words, phrases, or even entire sentences. The symbols are often written in such a way that they're compact and efficient, allowing the writer to get as much information as possible on a single page. While there are various systems of stenography, one of the most popular during World War II was the Pitman shorthand system, which relied on writing symbols in a way that represented the sound of a word rather than the letters. This system, once mastered, allowed resistance members to write quickly and efficiently often in a way that was completely unintelligible to anyone who wasn't trained in reading the shorthand.
But here's the twist. Stenography wasn't just about writing in shorthand. It was about hiding messages in plain sight. For instance, a resistance fighter might write a letter to a family member that looked completely normal at first glance, filled with mundane details about everyday life, but hidden in the shorthand were important dates, locations, or instructions. Imagine reading a letter from a friend
about a planned visit only to realize that beneath the surface, the letter was actually an encrypted message about the next operation, or perhaps a coded set of coordinates for a meeting point.
This method of covert communication was incredibly effective because it blended seamlessly with ordinary correspondence. A letter, a diary entry, or even a grocery list, any of these could be used to hide important information, as long as the writer knew the shorthand. Stenography didn't stand out as unusual writing, and the lack of context made it hard for enemy forces to detect. After all, who would suspect that a simple note could contain coded instructions that were vital for the resistance?
One of the most brilliant things about stenography was its ability to be adapted to fit the needs of the moment. A resistance fighter could use shorthand on a piece of paper and hide it in the lining of a jacket or a book, making it an ideal method for smuggling messages in plain sight. And since stenography was often used alongside other forms of secret communication like dead drops or the use of false documents, it became part of a larger multi-layered system of covert operations.
The resistance also used stenography to quickly encode information during meetings. A leader might scribble down a few lines of shorthand while discussing plans with others, and if anyone were to intercept the note, they'd be none the wiser. Stenography allowed for quick, silent communication that couldn't easily be deciphered by someone unfamiliar with the code. And because shorthand symbols could be written with speed and precision, this method often allowed for the rapid exchange of information when time was of the essence. Historians still debate whether stenography was a widespread method among civilian resistance networks, or if it was more common among military units. Some argue that it was particularly useful for those in high-risk areas where the enemy was actively searching for any form of communication. Others suggest that stenography was used more for internal communications was within resistance cells where everyone involved was already familiar with the shorthand system.
Still, the power of stenography lies in its adaptability. It wasn't just a method used in private correspondence. It also allowed for quick communication across various networks. A coded letter sent between underground fighters could easily pass through checkpoints without being noticed. The simplicity of the system, combined with its speed, made it an ideal tool for those who needed to get it information to their allies without raising suspicion.
It was like a secret language that no one could understand except for those who truly needed to know. In the next section, we'll shift gears and look at another fascinating method of secret communication, the use of visual codes and symbols. Just as music or clothing could be used to convey hidden messages, so too could symbols, things like graffiti, street art, or even simple gestures. These visual cues were used to signal messages without words, and in some cases, they were so subtle that they went unnoticed by the enemy. Stay with me because we're about to take a look at how these quiet signs of resistance helped people stay connected in a world where even the smallest mistake could be fatal. All right, now that we've explored the hidden world of stenography, let's turn to another fascinating form of secret communication: visual codes and symbols. You might not realize it, but throughout the war, something as simple as a symbol, a piece of graffiti, or a small visual cue could carry an immense amount of secret information. In the world of resistance, where speaking or writing could easily be intercepted, these visual forms of communication allowed fighters and civilians to convey messages without ever having to say a word. In essence, symbols became the secret language of the resistance, one that could be understood by those in the know, but remained completely invisible to the enemy. Let's start with graffiti, a form of visual code that at first glance might seem like an act of rebellion or simple vandalism. But in the context of occupied Europe, graffiti was often so much more than that. Resistance fighters used chalk paint and even knives to carve symbols into walls, posts, or building symbols that carried messages of resistance or directions to safe houses or even signals of when and where to strike. These symbols were often subtle, hidden in plain sight, and could easily be overlooked by anyone who wasn't actively looking for them. One of the most well-known symbols used by the French resistance was the V symbol, which stood for Vive la France, or victory. A simple V could be scrawled on a wall, on a train car, or even in the dirt. To the unknowing passerby, it might seem like a meaningless mark. But to a member of the resistance, it was a rallying cry, an expression of defiance, and a reminder that victory was still possible despite the oppressive occupation. The use of this symbol became so widespread that it became synonymous with the resistance itself. Historians still debate whether these symbols had a tangible impact on the morale of the population, or if they were primarily a way to communicate within the resistance. Some argue that these symbols gave people a sense of solidarity, an invisible network of shared resistance that transcended language barriers. Others suggest that the symbols were more effective at boosting morale among those already sympathetic to the cause while having little effect on the broader population. Either way, they were an essential part of the resistance's effort to maintain visibility and keep hope alive. But graffiti wasn't the only form of visual code used during the war. Resistance members also relied heavily on everyday objects and their positioning as subtle cues to pass along messages. Think of it as a secret language that didn't require words. One example of this was the strategic placement of items like hats, gloves, or newspapers. A resistance fighter might leave their hat at a cafe table in a certain position, signaling to a contact that they should meet or that an important message was waiting.
A glove perhaps left hanging from a tree branch could indicate that the area was safe for a meeting or that a courier had arrived.
In some cases, resistance members would make use of the physical landscape itself, arranging objects in a way that conveyed meaning. A pile of stones, a specific arrangement of branches, or a row of flowers placed in a certain pattern could signal a meeting point or the need for urgent action. These visual cues were often very subtle, but for those who knew how to read them, they were like a coded map that helped guide resistance operations. The beauty of these methods was that they were nearly impossible to detect unless you were trained to recognize them. To the average passerby, a pile of stones might just be a random stack. To a resistance member, it could indicate a hidden message. Even street art, which is often seen as an expression of personal or political sentiment, was used by the resistance as a way to communicate covertly. During the war, posters and graffiti would often carry more than just slogans. They would include hidden symbols or messages that could be interpreted only by those within the resistance. For example, a poster calling for the liberation of a city might include a small symbol at the bottom, such as a circle or a star, which indicated the location of a meeting or a safe route out of the city. In this way, art became another form of covert communication that went unnoticed by the authorities.
Symbols were also used in more practical ways. Resistance groups would often use common objects like books or pieces of jewelry to convey hidden meanings. A specific book in a library might indicate a coded meeting time, while a certain type of pendant or brooch could signal that a contact was in need of help. These everyday items, when viewed through the lens of the Resistance's secret codes, became powerful tools for communication. They were small, personal, and could easily be carried around without drawing attention, making them ideal for those trying to stay hidden in a world where being caught could mean death.
The use of visual codes didn't end with symbols or graffiti. Gestures and body language became a key part of how resistance members communicated in public. For instance, a slight movement of the hand, a nod of the head, or the way a person adjusted their clothing could all carry messages. These nonverbal cues were particularly useful in situations where talking was impossible. A simple flick of the wrist could mean everything's clear, or a raised eyebrow could signal something's wrong. In the chaos of occupied cities, these subtle signals allowed members of the resistance to communicate without ever uttering a word. Historians are still divided over how effective these visual forms of communication were, especially when it came to influencing the general population. Some argue that these visual codes played a key role in rallying people to the cause, while others believe they were mostly used by resistance fighters themselves to stay connected and share information. What is clear, however, is that they were a critical part of the larger network of secret communication techniques. Whether they were used to pass on vital information or simply to provide a glimmer of hope, visual codes became an essential part of the Resistance's toolkits. In the next section, we'll take a look at another unique method of covert communication: the secret radio operator. The use of clandestine radio broadcasts was a powerful way for resistance groups to communicate with each other, transmit vital information, and counter Nazi propaganda. But operating a secret radio station was no easy feat.
Stay tuned for an inside look at this fascinating, high risk method of communication. All right, now that we've explored how visual codes and symbols played a role in covert communication, it's time to turn our attention to one of the most vital yet risky methods of secret communication during World War II: the secret radio operator. Picture this: you're in a hidden room, your fingers lightly brushing the dials of a radio transmitter, trying to make contact with another resistance cell across enemy lines.
Every second counts, and you're aware that if the enemy picks up your transmission, it could mean the end not just for you, but for everyone involved. Despite the risks, secret radio operators became the unsung heroes of the resistance, transmitting life-saving messages across enemy territory, often under the nose of the Nazi forces.
The use of clandestine radios was one of the most ingenious methods of communication used by resistance fighters. These radios, often homemade or adapted from civilian models, allowed the resistance to send and receive messages over long distances. What made them so valuable was that they were essentially invisible. They could be hidden, operated in secret, and had the potential to reach far beyond the boundaries of occupied territories. It was the perfect tool for those who needed to communicate in an environment where every phone call and written letter was at risk of interception.
Historians still debate the exact role of radio communications in the resistance effort, with some suggesting that they were pivotal in keeping the resistance connected, while others argue that they were primarily used as a way to coordinate military activities or send messages to the Allies. Regardless, radio operators were key to passing along intelligence, alerting allies of German troop movements, and providing critical information that could alter the course of battles. But here's the catch: operating a secret radio station was dangerous work.
To start, there was the risk of detection. Radios transmit signals, and even though the resistance used various techniques to scramble their messages and avoid detection, the Nazis were highly skilled in monitoring radio frequencies. A single mistake in the transmission or an improper frequency setting could alert German forces to the presence of an unauthorized radio station. Operators had to be incredibly precise. One slip up, and they'd be caught. To make things even more precarious, these radio transmissions had to be brief. Any prolonged broadcast risked detection, as the enemy could triangulate the signal and pinpoint the radio operator's location.
In occupied France, for example, resistance groups relied on radio stations to communicate with the Allies, relaying information about German movements and providing vital updates on the situation in the country. These stations were often hidden in basements or attics far from prying eyes. The radio operators, who were often civilians with little to no training in electronics, would work in secrecy, communicating in coded messages. Sometimes the operators would even use false names or make arrangements to send specific signals at certain times, making it harder for the enemy to track the messages.
Despite the risks, radio operators became crucial to the survival of the resistance. Their broadcasts helped coordinate larger operations such as the D-Day invasion by informing the Allies of the readiness of the French resistance to rise up against German forces. These operators also kept morale high, sending out broadcasts that reminded civilians that the Allies were on their way and that the war wasn't lost. The simple act of broadcasting a message to the outside world was an act of defiance in itself.
affirmation that despite the occupation, the spirit of resistance was alive and well.
But how did these radio operators manage to evade detection? It wasn't just about scrambling their signals, it was also about the timing and frequency of the broadcasts. Resistance groups learned to operate their radios at specific times and for short intervals, making it harder for the enemy to detect and locate them. Some radio operators would even transmit from different locations to further confuse the Germans. Every transmission was a calculated risk, and the operators had to be meticulous using coded language and scrambling techniques to make sure their messages weren't intercepted by German listeners. One of the most fascinating aspects of this whole operation was the role of women in radio operations. While women often played a crucial role in other forms of resistance, they were particularly instrumental in the operation of secret radios. Women often served as radio operators, messages couriers, or assistants in the transmission process. Despite the dangers many women took on this role, risking their lives to help keep the communication lines open. Women's contributions in the realm of clandestine radio work were often overlooked in history, but they played a vital part in ensuring that the resistance could keep in touch with the outside world. Of course, even with all these precautions, there was still the ever-present threat of capture. Nazi forces would go to great lengths to find the underground radio operators. They would use technology to search for radio signals, or they would interrogate anyone suspected of being involved in resistance activities. If a radio operator was caught, the consequences were dire. They would face execution or torture, and the entire resistance cell could be compromised. And yet, despite the risks, these brave individuals continued to operate in secret, knowing that their work could change the course of the war. In some cases, secret radio operations were so successful that they remained undetected for years. Some operators were even able to continue broadcasting after the war had ended, transmitting messages to the Allies until they were finally discovered. But for the vast majority of radio operators, their work was short-lived, caught between the danger of detection and the pressing need to transmit information. They operated in the shadows, knowing that every second counted. So, as we take a moment to appreciate the incredible work of these radio operators, it's important to remember that they were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The underground communication network made up of couriers, dead drops, stenographers, and more worked together to ensure the survival of the resistance. These unsung heroes made sure that the light of hope and defiance never went out, even in the darkest hours of the war.
In the next section, we'll take a look at how the resistance used false documents and forged IDs to keep people safe and move them across occupied borders. It's another ingenious aspect of the resistance's operations, and you won't want to miss how these everyday tools became vital for survival in enemy territory. Now that we've explored the incredible work of secret radio operators, let's dive into another brilliant aspect of resistance communication: false documents and forged IDs. In occupied Europe, one of the most essential tools for resistance fighters, spies, and refugees was the ability to pass through enemy checkpoints unnoticed. And the way they achieved this was by using counterfeit documents. Documents that were so well crafted that they could fool even the most vigilant Nazi officers. Fake IDs, forged travel papers, and altered ration cards became lifelines for those living under occupation.
These documents weren't just about getting from one place to another, they were about survival.
The use of false documents was in many ways an art form. The resistance had to create papers that not only looked real, but also served a variety of purposes. A false identity could be used to allow someone to escape from a dangerous area, to smuggle goods, or to pass through military checkpoints. But crafting a believable false identity required a deep knowledge of Nazi bureaucracy, and the resistance members who specialized in this skill were often some of the most talented and careful operatives.
Imagine this, you're a resistance fighter moving through the streets of Paris. You've got an important message to deliver, but the Gestapo is everywhere. You can't risk being caught. So you rely on your forged documents to get you through. You pull out a passport neatly stamped with the right signatures and an official-looking photograph and approach the checkpoint with confidence. The Nazi officer glances at the document. Everything checks out. You're cleared to pass, and just like that, you've avoided capture.
This is how false documents became essential for both civilians and resistance fighters. They allowed people to travel without raising suspicion, hide in plain sight, and even escape to neutral countries. But how did the resistance create these documents? It wasn't as simple as printing off a few fake papers. The forgers working for the resistance had to make sure that every detail was correct. They used high-quality paper authentic stamps and accurate typefaces that would stand up to close inspection. The idea was to make the forged papers so convincing that they couldn't be distinguished from the real thing. One of the most well-known examples of forged documents was the creation of fake passports. These passports would often be altered to show false names and backgrounds, allowing resistance members to escape arrest or move freely within occupied territories. But it wasn't just about the documents themselves. It was about the network of people who helped facilitate their use. Resistance fighters relied on safe houses and underground networks to distribute these forged papers to the people who needed them most. Whether it was helping a Jewish family escape or getting a resistance fighter across a border, these documents were a critical part of the resistance movement.
Historians still argue over the exact scale of the forgery operations within the resistance. Some suggest that entire underground presses were dedicated to producing these fake documents, while others argue that it was a more informal, decentralized process. In any case, what's clear is that these forgeries were an essential tool for survival. The people who forged these documents, whether they were skilled artisans or just ordinary citizens with the right resources, played a crucial role in helping countless individuals escape the horrors of occupation. But forging documents wasn't without its risks. For one, it required access to a variety of tools from typewriters to stamp presses, which were often hard to come by in occupied territories. Many forgers had to work with whatever resources they could find, sometimes using old, worn-out typewriters or makeshift stamp designs. Additionally, the act of creating fake documents was highly illegal, and those caught producing or using counterfeit papers faced severe punishment. A forger's workshop was often a target for German intelligence, and if they were caught, the consequences could be fatal.
Still, the demand for false documents remained high throughout the war. Not only did these papers allow resistance members to move undetected, but they were also vital for helping civilians escape persecution. Many Jewish people used forged documents to avoid being deported to concentration camps. Entire families could be saved by a single forged passport or identity card. These papers often provided the difference between life and death for those who found themselves caught in the web of Nazi oppression. One fascinating example of the use of false documents comes from the story of a man named Jean Moulin, a key figure in the French resistance. Moulin used his fake identity as a cover to organize resistance operations and rally support among different groups. His forgeries allowed him to travel through occupied France and meet with resistance leaders without drawing attention. The ability to move freely thanks to his forged documents was crucial to his success in coordinating the resistance efforts across the country. It wasn't just about personal survival either. These false documents were used for strategic purposes as well. The resistance would often create fake travel permits, making it possible for key fighters to cross into enemy territory undetected. In some cases, false documents were used to infiltrate German-controlled areas, allowing resistance members to gather vital intelligence or carry out sabotage operations.
Historians often point to the fact that many of these forged documents were issued by underground networks posing as legitimate organizations. These networks were set up to mimic real government offices, creating the illusion of authenticity. By having these underground presses issue fake documents that looked official, the resistance could make their forgeries far more convincing. In a world where the enemy was on high alert and every movement was scrutinized, the ability to pass through checkpoints with a valid-looking document was an invaluable asset. In the next section, we'll look at a completely different form of covert communication, using nature itself to send secret messages. Believe it or not, trees, animals, and even weather patterns became part of the resistance's covert language, and these natural elements helped ensure that messages were passed along without detection. Stay with me, this is about to get even more fascinating. As we continue our journey through the ingenious methods of covert communication used by the resistance, let's shift our focus to something you might not expect: nature itself. Yes, in a world where every form of communication was potentially under surveillance, resistance fighters turned to the natural world to convey secret messages. From trees and animals to the weather, the environment became a vital tool in the underground network of communication. These natural elements were carefully observed, manipulated, and even used as signals to pass along critical information, all without a word being spoken or a letter being written. One of the most fascinating ways nature was used to communicate was through the careful placement of signs in the environment. Imagine you're walking through a forest or across a field. To an untrained eye, everything might seem ordinary. But for a resistance member, every tree, every patch of grass, every stone could be a clue. For example, a certain type of flower placed in a particular way could indicate that a safe house was nearby. A tree with a notch carved in it might signal that a courier had passed through and left a message. The positioning of branches, rocks, or even fallen leaves could be used as signals to mark safe paths or
indicate that it was time for a covert meeting. These subtle signs allowed resistance members to find their way through occupied areas without ever leaving behind a trace.
In some cases, messages were hidden in the patterns of the landscape itself. Resistance fighters knew to look for specific markers or natural cues that only they would recognize. For example, a particular tree in a forest might have been marked with a unique symbol carved into its bark, something that would be invisible to the casual observer, but immediately recognizable to those trained to look for it.
These markers were used to guide people to key locations or convey vital information like the timing of an attack or a change in plans.
Historians still debate just how widespread this practice was, but it's clear that these natural markers played a role in communication networks that spanned entire regions. The ability to use the landscape as a medium for passing messages was incredibly effective because it was nearly impossible to detect. Resistance members didn't have to rely on written messages that could be intercepted. They could simply follow a path through the woods or across a field, knowing that the environment itself would guide them to safety.
But it wasn't just the landscape that was used to communicate. Animals played a crucial role in the resistance's use of nature as a communication tool as well.
Homing pigeons, as we've seen, were a well-known example of how animals were enlisted for communication. But there were other animals used in more subtle ways. For example, in some cases, the movement or behavior of animals could be used to convey a message. If a resistance fighter was waiting for a signal to proceed, the movement of a bird, the rustling of a rabbit in the bushes, or the sound of a particular animal might indicate that it was safe to continue. Animals became living, breathing signals that could be relied upon in ways that no human could be.
One particularly interesting example of animals being used as part of covert communication came from the use of dogs. Dogs, known for their keen sense of smell and hearing, were often used by the resistance to detect danger or alert members to the presence of enemies. In some instances, dogs were trained to lead couriers through difficult terrain or to protect important messages. These dogs, often disguised as normal pets, were crucial for guiding people through dangerous areas without drawing suspicion. Their natural instincts made them invaluable allies in the fight for survival. The weather, too, was a part of this natural communication system. Resistance groups often used weather patterns as signals to indicate when action needed to be taken or when a meeting had to be moved. For example, a sudden shift in wind direction or a change in temperature might signal that a message had been sent or that a particular area was now safe for operation. If a particular storm or weather event was predicted, resistance members could use it as a cover for a secret meeting or a delivery. In the chaos of a storm, it would be nearly impossible to detect the movement of couriers or resistance members, making weather patterns an effective tool for both concealment and communication. One historical debate among scholars is whether these natural methods of communication were used by large-scale resistance movements, or if they were more common in smaller localized groups. Some argue that these techniques were more often used in rural areas where the landscape provided greater opportunities for subtlety, while others believe that urban resistance groups also used these methods, relying on city parks, alleyways, and even small courtyards to hide messages.
It's also worth noting that these methods required a great deal of trust and coordination. Those involved had to know exactly what to look for and understand the subtle language of nature that was being used to convey messages. The beauty of using nature for communication was that it was completely organic and difficult to trace. Unlike written letters or phone calls, which could be intercepted or overheard, natural signals were hidden in plain sight. A tree marked with a small cut in the bark could look like any other tree to an untrained eye, but to someone in the know, it was a crucial part of a larger communication network. In a time when surveillance was constant and every word could be dangerous, using the natural world to pass messages was a brilliant way to stay one step ahead of the enemy. In the next section, we'll explore another fascinating aspect of covert communication, the use of microfilm. While it may seem like a technology straight out of a spy movie, microfilm was one of the most secure ways to transmit vast amounts of information without ever raising suspicion. How did resistance fighters use microfilm and how did it manage to avoid detection by the enemy? Trust me, this is a technique you won't want to miss. Now let's take a closer look at one of the more technical and yet incredibly effective tools of covert communication used by the resistance microfilm. You may be familiar with it from spy thrillers, but during World War II, microfilm wasn't just something out of a James Bond movie. It was a lifeline for resistance groups, a way to transmit critical information while keeping it almost entirely hidden from the enemy. Imagine being able to condense entire documents into a film reel no bigger than a matchbook, essentially hiding volumes of information in a tiny, inconspicuous package. That's the power of microfilm. Microfilm works by reducing documents, photographs, or other visual materials into a minuscule size, making them easier to hide and transport. During the war, resistance groups used it to carry everything from secret plans to intelligence reports, all while avoiding the dangers of writing, which could be intercepted by the enemy. A single reel of microfilm could contain dozens, if not hundreds of pages of information, and it could be hidden almost anywhere inside the lining of a coat sewn into a book, or even inside a box of candy. It was the ultimate stealth mode for communication, and it allowed resistance fighters to send detailed messages across borders without raising suspicion.
So, how did it work? At its core, microfilm was a method of storing images in miniature format. You'd take a regular sized document, photograph it, and then shrink it down to a fraction of its size, usually onto a reel of film. The beauty of microfilm was that it could hold a vast amount of information in an incredibly compact form. For example, a full report that would normally take up an entire folder could be reduced to a tiny reel that could be carried in your pocket. This made it ideal for couriers and operatives who could transport the film without drawing attention.
Historians still debate whether microfilm was one of the most effective methods of resistance communication. Some argue that it was an essential tool allowing operatives to move large quantities of information without alerting the enemy. Others point out that microfilm's success was limited by the fact that it required specialized equipment to read, and not everyone had access to a microfilm reader during the war. However, even with those limitations, the resistance continued to rely on it as a secure form of communication.
One key advantage of microfilm was its ability to elude detection.
Unlike written letters or radio transmissions, which could be intercepted or decoded, microfilm was almost impossible to detect unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. Even if the enemy searched your personal belongings, they might find nothing more suspicious than a small reel of film. That's what made it so powerful. A single microfilm reel could contain a wealth of intelligence, and it could pass through enemy lines without ever being noticed. Now, let's talk about the risks involved. For one, microfilm was relatively expensive to produce, and not everyone in the resistance had access to the necessary equipment to create it. But once the film was created, it became a secure and highly effective way to transmit information. That said, the process of photographing documents and shrinking them onto microfilm was delicate work. One mistake could ruin the entire reel, potentially compromising an entire mission. And just like with any other form of covert communication, microfilm required careful handling. If the enemy ever got their hands on it, the consequences would be disastrous.
The true beauty of microfilm wasn't just in its ability to hide large amounts of information, it was also in its portability. For example, if a resistance fighter needed to send critical information across occupied Europe, they could hide the microfilm in a piece of everyday clothing or in the bottom of a suitcase. When couriers had to cross enemy checkpoints, they would simply carry the microfilm with them, knowing that it was secure and could be read only by those who knew how to decode it. Microfilm could even be smuggled in food packages disguised as nothing more than an ordinary part of everyday life. It wasn't just about sending information either. The microfilm could also be used to store maps, photographs, or lists of contacts, all in a format that was easy to transport and difficult to detect. This made it an ideal tool for coordination. If you needed to relay the location of a meeting spot or the identity of a contact, microfilm was the safest option. It could store highly detailed maps and even photographs of key locations, allowing resistance fighters to plan operations with pinpoint precision. Resistance movements were very resourceful in the way they used microfilm. In some cases, they even set up secret processing units where they could create and read microfilm under the cover of darkness. These units were hidden in basements, abandoned warehouses, or underground bunkers, ensuring that the production and decoding of microfilm would go unnoticed.
Some of the most significant operations carried out during the war were made possible through the use of microfilm. For example, in France, the resistance used microfilm to send detailed intelligence reports about German troop movements to the Allies. These reports, condensed onto tiny rolls of film, provided crucial information that helped the Allies plan attacks and launch operations. Without microfilm, this type of communication would have been nearly impossible. Radio transmissions could easily be intercepted, and written messages were too risky to send through occupied areas.
One of the most famous examples of microfilm use came during the Normandy invasion. The Allies received crucial information about German defenses courtesy of microfilm that was sent by resistance fighters in France. The information, which was critical to the success of the D-Day landings, was sent in multiple microfilm packets, each containing detailed intelligence about German fortifications, troop placements, and other vital data. This operation could not have been executed as effectively without the use of microfilm as a communication tool.
So, as we look back at the various methods the resistance used to stay in touch and coordinate their efforts, It's clear that microfilm was one of the most secure and ingenious solutions for passing on sensitive information. It allowed them to move large quantities of data without detection, and it provided them with a tool to stay connected, even when every other form of communication was under constant threat of interception. In the next section, we'll take a look at how even the most mundane aspects of everyday life, like food, became carriers of secret messages. It's truly fascinating to see how the resistance used even the simplest objects to communicate in a world where nothing could be taken for granted. Now that we've explored the hidden world of microfilm, let's turn to something even more basic: food. Yes, food, one of the most mundane everyday items, became an unlikely but incredibly important medium for covert communication during the war. In a world where every letter and phone call was potentially monitored, the resistance had to get creative with the things that seemed perfectly ordinary. And food, being something that everyone had to eat, became one of the most effective ways to pass on messages without raising suspicion. It sounds almost unbelievable, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. People would carry messages in the most discreet ways possible, hiding them inside pieces of bread, wrapped in layers of pastry, or tucked between the skins of vegetables. These hidden messages could contain anything from a secret meeting location to instructions about when to strike or when to evacuate. The beauty of using food as a medium for covert communication was that it could be passed between people without drawing attention. No one would ever suspect that a loaf of bread or an apple could carry vital intelligence. Imagine this. You're a resistance member in a busy town square waiting for a contact. You've got a loaf of bread with you, a simple item that could easily pass for a lunch. But inside that loaf of bread is a tiny rolled up note written in a code that only you and your contact can understand. You slip the loaf into a basket and the message is passed along without anyone being the wiser. Even if a German soldier were to stop you and ask what's in the basket, you'd have an innocent explanation. A piece of bread is nothing more than a piece of food until it's not. One of the most ingenious methods involved hiding messages inside food that was commonly consumed, such as loaves of bread, cakes, or pastries. The food would be carefully prepared in a way that allowed the message to be concealed without altering its outward appearance. A note could be carefully folded and placed inside the dough, and after baking, the bread would look completely normal. It wasn't until the bread was sliced open that the message would be revealed. This simple yet effective technique was a lifesaver for many, especially in areas where paper or other forms of communication would be too risky to use. Historians are still debating the scale of this particular method of covert communication. Some argue that it was widely used across occupied territories, especially in rural areas where the resistance had more control over the local food supply. Others suggest that it was more of a localized technique often used by smaller resistance cells who didn't have access to other methods of communication. What's clear, however, is that food as a means of communication was an incredibly low-tech but highly effective strategy. But it wasn't just about bread. In some cases, messages would be hidden inside fruits or vegetables. Imagine receiving a package of apples or pears only to find that one of them had been carefully hollowed out and inside was a hidden message.
These messages would often be small rolled up papers written in tiny, near illegible handwriting and carefully inserted into the hollowed out interior of the fruit. The key to this technique was that the fruit would appear perfectly normal, and unless someone knew exactly what to look for, the message would go unnoticed. This was a perfect example of how resistance fighters could pass information in plain sight without drawing any suspicion.
In addition to fruit and bread, food packaging also served as an effective medium for communication. For example, a sack of flour or a bag of sugar could be used to hide messages. By making small alterations to the packaging, perhaps slightly tearing a corner of the bag, or subtly shifting the contents, it was possible to conceal a message inside without it being immediately obvious. Resistance members would use these methods to smuggle papers through checkpoints, passing vital intelligence along without the enemy ever suspecting a thing. But here's the catch: the person receiving the food had to be vigilant. They needed to know where to look and what to expect. Sometimes food wasn't just about the message hidden inside it, was about the way the food was prepared or the subtle signals that it gave off. For example, the shape or appearance of a loaf of bread might indicate that a message had been concealed inside, or the way a fruit was sliced could signal that it was part of a larger communication network. These small, seemingly insignificant details were often the key to deciphering the hidden messages.
The biggest advantage of using food in this way was that it allowed for communication to happen in the most public of spaces without drawing attention. Imagine trying to pass a secret letter in a crowded market. Anyone could spot it, and the message could easily be intercepted. But by using food, the act of passing information became far less suspicious. A loaf of bread or an apple could be handed over just as easily as a simple gift or a token of goodwill, and it would be passed on without anyone ever questioning its true purpose. The risk, of course, came from the possibility of detection. If the wrong person happened to open the loaf of bread or slice the fruit, they might discover the hidden message, and that could spell disaster for everyone involved. But the resistance members who used food in this way were incredibly careful, often working with trusted contacts and ensuring that only the right people knew how to find the messages hidden inside their food. This level of trust was essential for the success of the operation.
Food as a medium of covert communication wasn't the only creative method the resistance used to pass along messages. In the next section, we'll take a look at how people used light and shadows to signal one another across distances, creating secret ways to communicate in plain view without anyone suspecting a thing. You'll see just how innovative the resistance was when it came to staying connected in a world where even the smallest misstep could be fatal. Now that we've explored how food became a covert method of communication, let's shine a light on another ingenious tactic used by the resistance, signaling through light and shadows. You might think that light is the last thing you'd want to use for secret communication. After all, it makes you visible, right? But during the war, resistance fighters found clever ways to use light itself, as well as the shadows it cast, to send messages without anyone noticing. It's one of the most subtle yet effective techniques, relying on the power of contrast to convey critical information.
Imagine this. It's late at night and you're standing at a street corner. The only light nearby is the soft glow from a street lamp. To an untrained observer, the light is just an ordinary part of the environment. But for you and your contact, it's a secret beacon. By simply adjusting the angle of your body or casting a shadow in a particular way, you could signal to your contact that it was safe to approach or even convey specific instructions. A slight change in position could send a message that would go unnoticed by everyone else, but would be perfectly clear to the person on the other end. One of the most common methods used by the resistance was signaling through the use of lamps or lanterns. This technique often took place in urban environments where houses and buildings were packed tightly together, and the nights could be as dangerous as the days. Imagine walking down a quiet street at night when suddenly you spot a light flickering in a window. To the casual observer, it might look like nothing more than a lamp shifting in the breeze or a flicker from an old bulb. But for you, it's a coded signal. It could mean that a safe house is secure, that a meeting is about to take place, or even that an operation is in motion. This signaling method was so effective because it blended into the environment. Unlike radio transmissions, which could be intercepted or triangulated, or written letters, which could be read by anyone, light signals were harder to detect. Unless the enemy knew exactly what to look for, the small movements of light and shadow could pass unnoticed. Resistance fighters quickly realized that small, seemingly insignificant changes in the lighting around them could convey massive amounts of information without anyone being the wiser. Historians still argue whether light-based signaling was as widely used as other methods like dead drops or couriers, but it's clear that it played a role in many successful resistance operations. What made light and shadow signaling particularly valuable was its ability to communicate without words, leaving no trace. Once the light flickered and the signal was sent, there was no physical evidence to trace back to the sender. A simple movement could be enough to convey everything from a coded message to a warning or a call to action.
But it wasn't just about flicking a light on and off or casting a shadow in a certain way. The resistance developed entire systems of lighting to create complex messages. For instance, they might use the pattern of light in a window, such as whether it was fully lit or dimmed, to indicate specific dates or times. Similarly, shadows cast by objects in a room could be interpreted in different ways, providing information about when and where to meet or whether an area was under surveillance. These subtle cues were part of a secret visual language that only those trained in the resistance's methods could understand. One of the most famous examples of using light as a secret communication method took place in occupied France, where the resistance relied heavily on covert signals during the war. Resistance members would use a simple, old fashioned lantern to signal to one another. By adjusting the lantern's flame, either by dimming it or allowing it to shine more brightly, they could indicate a variety of things. A brief flash might mean danger or stay away, while a steady glow could signal a safe house or a meeting point. Over time, a system of coded light signals was developed that allowed the resistance to communicate over great distances without ever having to speak or write anything down.
But there was more to it than just signaling through light itself. The shadows cast by light could be just as powerful in sending covert messages. Think about it. Shadows are the perfect medium for subtle communication. In a dark alley, you might see a shadow of a person standing by a lamp. The way they position themselves could tell you everything you need to know about whether it's safe to approach.
A person standing directly in the light might be a signal that danger is nearby, while a shadow in the corner could signal that it's safe to proceed. In this way, shadows became a kind of living code, a language of silence and stealth.
This technique wasn't just confined to urban areas. Resistance fighters in rural areas also adapted light and shadow signaling to communicate. For example, they would use lanterns to signal the arrival of a courier or to alert others of the success or failure of a mission. The placement of a light near a tree or the careful way a lantern was positioned in a field could convey vital information about the status of an operation or whether a safe route was clear. These signals weren't just for military operations. They were part of the larger communication network that kept the resistance coordinated and in motion. One of the greatest challenges, of course, was ensuring that these light signals weren't noticed by the enemy. This is where discretion became essential. Resistance fighters had to be constantly aware of their surroundings, especially in urban areas where German soldiers and collaborators were likely to be nearby. Even the smallest flash of light could be spotted by a watchful enemy, so resistance members had to be discreet about when and how they used light signals. Some of the more sophisticated systems involved using very dim lights, or shielding the light in such a way that it was visible only to those in the know. Historians still debate how widespread this method was, especially when compared to more well-known communication techniques like radios or coded letters. But it's clear that in the right circumstances, light-based signaling was a powerful, almost invisible way to communicate. It was a tool that blended seamlessly into everyday life, allowing resistance groups to stay connected even in the most dangerous of environments.
In the next section, we'll explore how the role of children in the resistance added another layer of complexity to the communication networks. Though young and often unaware of the full gravity of their actions, children were integral to the survival of many underground operations. Let's see how these brave little couriers helped carry messages across occupied Europe. As we've seen, covert communication during the war wasn't confined to just adults. It also extended to children who played a surprising yet crucial role in the Resistance's network of secret messengers. You might think that children with their limited understanding of the war's full scope would be far too vulnerable to participate in espionage. But in reality, they were often some of the most vital players in the resistance.
These young couriers, often unaware of the full consequences of their actions, became indispensable in the underground network transporting messages and helping to keep operations moving under the radar of Nazi authorities. Children were perfect for this type of work because they could easily blend into their surroundings. They weren't expected to be carrying messages or working for the underground, so they often escaped the suspicion that would fall on adults. Imagine for a moment a child walking down the street, their hands full of simple items like a loaf of bread, a bouquet of flowers, or a school book. To anyone watching, they seemed completely harmless. But inside that loaf of bread, hidden between the pages of the book or tucked inside the bouquet, could be a critical message for a fellow resistance member. One of the most striking examples of children's roles in the resistance came from occupied France, where they helped carry messages, act as lookouts, and even deliver important documents or supplies to safe houses.
Though the children were often unaware of the specifics of the messages they were carrying, they still understood the importance of their tasks. For many, this work was a simple, everyday part of life, a way to help their families and their communities. But the consequences of these actions were incredibly high. If a child was caught carrying a message, the repercussions could be fatal, not just for the child, but for everyone involved. The way children participated in the resistance varied. Some were tasked with running small errands like fetching supplies or delivering simple messages. Others played a more direct role in coordinating larger resistance operations. Children were also sometimes used to spy on German soldiers, collecting information that could later be passed on to the underground. For instance, a child might overhear a conversation about troop movements, or see a German officer meeting with collaborators and report back with the information. What made children so valuable was their ability to move freely in spaces where adults could not. They could walk past German soldiers without raising suspicion, go to places like markets or schools where adult resistance fighters might not be able to, and move through enemy lines without a second glance. In occupied France, children were often recruited by their families or other resistance members to deliver messages between different cells, passing information in ways that would have been impossible for adults. They were trained to understand basic codes and symbols, allowing them to carry out their tasks with minimal risk.
Historians still debate the extent to which children's involvement in the resistance was widespread, and whether their role was as significant as that of adult fighters. Some argue that the scale of their involvement is often underestimated. With many child couriers working in the shadows, their contributions largely overlooked in the historical record. Others suggest that children's roles were more peripheral, focused on small tasks and not as integral to larger military operations. Either way, their involvement was undeniably important. Without their courage and willingness to participate in these dangerous tasks, many resistance operations would have faltered.
One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of children's involvement in the resistance was the fact that they were often put in danger without fully understanding the gravity of their actions. Resistance groups typically kept the details of their operations secret, and the children who carried messages weren't always told the specifics of what they were doing. For many young couriers, the simple task of delivering a letter or passing along a message was just part of everyday life, something they did without fully grasping the risks involved. However, once a child was given a task like this, they became an important part of the network and the stakes became incredibly high. If they were caught, they would likely be arrested, interrogated, or even executed. The thought of a child being caught with a secret message and the subsequent horrors they could face makes their involvement in the resistance all the more poignant. But children were also deeply affected by the war in other ways. Many young people became involved in the resistance because they saw the pain and suffering of their families and communities. They understood that their actions, however small, could make a difference. Many resistance movements made it clear to their child careers that they were part of something larger, something that could help free their country and protect their families. This sense of duty, combined with their ability to move unnoticed, made children an essential part of the underground network.
There are many stories of children who became resistance heroes despite their age. Some were even honored posthumously for their bravery. Take, for example, the story of the young French girl Danielle, who was just 10 years old when she helped the resistance by smuggling messages across enemy lines. She was caught by the Germans, but even as they interrogated her, she remained calm, refusing to give up any information. Her courage helped inspire others and served as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of such danger.
Despite their young age, these couriers and spies were trained to be incredibly resourceful. They would hide messages in the most creative places inside a book, sewn into a piece of clothing, or even hidden in the soles of their shoes. In many cases, children were taught how to decode simple ciphers or to recognize certain symbols that could lead them to a safe house or meeting point. Resistance fighters understood that by training the younger generation, they could ensure the continuity of the network and keep it going even when older members were captured or killed.
Historians still argue whether the use of children in the resistance was as widespread and significant as adult participation. But one thing is certain, their bravery and resilience were essential to the survival of the movement. By relying on children to carry out tasks that others couldn't, the resistance ensured that their communication network stayed alive and that vital information continued to flow even when the risks were higher than ever.
In the next section, we'll take a look at the dangers of mistakes in secret communication and how even the slightest slip up could have disastrous consequences. In a world where the smallest misstep could result in exposure, the need for absolute precision and secrecy became all the more critical. Stay with me, this part of the story is one of the most intense. As we've seen, resistance fighters, couriers, and even children became vital pieces in a secret communication network. But this whole web of covert operations was fragile, and even the smallest mistake could have catastrophic consequences. Every communication method, whether it was a letter, a phone call, or a signal, had to be executed with absolute precision. A single slip up, a misinterpreted message, or a moment of carelessness could not only endanger the person directly involved, but could unravel entire networks of resistance fighters, leading to arrests, betrayal, and even death.
In the world of espionage, where stakes were life and death, there was no room for error. Mistakes in communication could happen in many ways. Perhaps the most obvious danger was interception. Whether it was a letter, a phone call, or a radio transmission, the enemy was always on the lookout for any sign of secret communication. The Nazis had a vast network of spies and informants, and they also used advanced technology to monitor phone lines, radio frequencies, and mail. If a resistance member misused a cipher or sent a message over an unsecured channel, there was a real danger that it could be intercepted by the enemy. Once intercepted, even the most innocuous message could be decoded, and it would expose the entire operation to the Germans. Historians argue about how often such communications were intercepted. Some say that the resistance's use of encryption and codes kept most messages secure, while others believe that the Germans were far more successful at breaking codes than we often acknowledge. It's important to remember that in the world of espionage, even the smallest failure to maintain security could be disastrous. One simple mistake, such as incorrectly sealing an envelope or using the wrong signal, could expose an entire operation, causing irreparable harm to the resistance's efforts.
But the dangers didn't just stem from interception. Sometimes mistakes happen during the execution of covert communication itself. Take, for example, the act of passing a message using a dead drop. These locations, carefully chosen to avoid detection, relied on the precise timing and correct understanding of the signals that indicated a message was waiting. If a courier arrived at a dead drop location too early or too late, they risked revealing the site to the enemy, or worse, attracting attention to themselves. Even something as simple as an incorrect timing or an unfamiliar gesture could cause suspicion.
One particularly dangerous mistake was the misinterpretation of a code. Resistance networks often relied on a shared understanding of codes, whether they were written spoken or visual. However, if even a single person misunderstood or forgot part of the code, the entire message could be corrupted. The result could be a series of disastrous missteps, especially if people were sent to the wrong locations or operated on incorrect information. Imagine being part of a group where a simple miscommunication about a rendezvous time or a meeting point could lead to an ambush by enemy soldiers.
In addition to mistakes in the interpretation of codes, there was also the risk of human error when it came to physical security. Resistance members were often tasked with hiding messages or documents in everyday objects, pieces of food books, or even clothing. If a resistance fighter accidentally dropped a letter or revealed their hidden stash, they risked exposing not just their own location, but the entire network that depended on them. One careless act of revealing or mishandling the message could lead to arrest and betrayal.
One of the most tragic stories of a communication breakdown comes from the story of an operation in Paris. A group of resistance fighters had carefully planned a mission to sabotage a German convoy. The instructions were passed through a series of carefully encoded messages, and each member of the group was given precise orders. But during the exchange of one critical message, a single error was made. A letter was misaddressed, and the wrong person received it. The result, the mission was compromised. The wrong person showed up at the meeting spot, and the entire operation was blown. Several members of the resistance were captured and executed, while others were forced to flee. This single error in communication highlighted just how high the stakes were. It wasn't just a mistake, it was the difference between life and death.
As devastating as these mistakes were, they also underscored the importance of trust. Resistance members had to rely on each other with complete faith.
Faith that the messages would be transmitted accurately, that the codes would be understood, and that no one would break the chain. When mistakes happened, it wasn't just a failure in communication, it was a betrayal of that trust. And trust was the only thing that kept the resistance going.
One of the most important lessons from the mistakes of the resistance is the constant need for vigilance. There were always new risks, new ways the enemy could intercept or decode communications, new challenges in maintaining secrecy. Resistance groups constantly had to adapt, refine their methods, and remain agile. Even in moments when it seemed like the network was perfectly secure, the threat of exposure was always looming.
The dangers of mistakes in communication weren't just limited to practical issues. There were also psychological pressures at play. The tension of knowing that one slip could end an operation or cost lives created an environment where resistance members had to be meticulous in everything they did. There was little room for error, and the stress of this constant pressure could take its toll. Many resistance fighters dealt with the fear of being caught, the burden of secrecy, and the weight of knowing that their work might cost them their lives. In the next section, we'll explore the psychological aspect of resistance communication and the personal toll it took on those involved. The pressure to stay hidden to maintain secrecy and to constantly live in fear of discovery affected not just the fighters on the front lines, but the entire underground network. Get ready to dive into the mental and emotional costs of living in a world where trust, secrecy, and vigilance were the only thing standing between survival and exposure. As we have seen, the resistance networks during the war relied heavily on communication, secrecy, and trust. But the pressure to maintain that secrecy and avoid mistakes was incredibly taxing, not just physically, but psychologically. Imagine living every day under constant surveillance, knowing that any misstep could result in death, not only for you, but for everyone around you. The mental toll of this constant fear, the stress of living in the shadows, and the weight of responsibility can't be overstated.
The resistance fighters didn't just battle the enemy forces, they also fought their own anxieties, doubts, and the emotional exhaustion that came from living a life of constant vigilance. One of the most intense psychological pressures came from the knowledge that at any given moment, the enemy could be one step ahead. The Nazis had a vast network of spies, informants, and collaborators who were constantly on the lookout for anyone who might be working against them. The fear of betrayal was a constant presence, especially since many resistance fighters had to operate within occupied cities where the enemy was never far away. The mere thought of being discovered could be enough to send a person into a spiral of anxiety and paranoia.
Historians have often debated the mental toll this kind of life took on the people involved in the resistance. For many, living in constant fear of discovery could lead to psychological breakdowns. Resistance fighters, couriers, and even children who helped deliver messages had to remain calm and composed, knowing that one wrong move could expose them to the enemy. Many resistance members reported feelings of extreme isolation, knowing that they couldn't trust anyone fully. Their lives were secret, and they couldn't openly share their burdens or their fears with others. This isolation often led to feelings of despair, and many resistance fighters struggled to cope with the emotional weight of their work. The constant fear of betrayal was also a huge source of stress. In every resistance cell, there were members who worked tirelessly to keep communication channels secure. But even with the best efforts, there was always the risk of someone slipping up intentionally or accidentally. The constant threat of informants within the ranks created an environment where suspicion and distrust were rampant. This made it difficult for members to form close bonds as everyone was on edge, afraid that their fellow fighters might be secretly working for the enemy. And yet, despite these fears, the resistance had to maintain cohesion and trust if they were to succeed. One of the most remarkable aspects of the resistance was the sheer resilience of its members. Despite the constant psychological pressure, they continued to carry out their work, finding ways to maintain morale and focus.
For many, the belief in the cause, whether it was the hope of liberation, the desire to protect their families, or the need to resist tyranny, was what kept them going. The emotional toll was undeniably high, but it was the strength of their conviction that allowed them to keep fighting day after day, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. For some, the psychological toll of this constant stress was too much. Many resistance members suffered from anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD long before these conditions were recognized or treated. The loss of friends, the constant threat of death, and the weight of their secret lives left deep scars on many individuals. Even after the war ended, many members of the resistance struggled to reintegrate into society, haunted by the experiences they had endured. In many cases, these psychological wounds went unnoticed or untreated as resistance members were expected to simply move on with their lives. But for many, the trauma of their work in the resistance was something that stayed with them for the rest of their lives.
The emotional toll wasn't just felt by the fighters, it affected their families as well. Imagine being a parent knowing that your child is involved in resistance work and could be discovered at any moment. The fear of losing loved ones was a constant burden for families who had to live with the knowledge that one slip up could result in arrest, torture, or death. Many resistance fighters kept their work a secret from their families, which only added to the emotional strain. They had to live in a world of constant uncertainty, never knowing if today might be the day that their secret lives were exposed.
Despite the immense psychological pressure, the resistance found ways to cope. Many used humor and camaraderie as ways to lighten the mood, if only for a brief moment. Resistance fighters often found solace in their friendships, knowing that they shared the same fears, the same hopes, and the same determination. There was also a sense of purpose that helped them push through the toughest moments. They were part of something larger than themselves, and that sense of solidarity of being part of a greater cause kept them going when things seemed impossible.
One of the most powerful ways the resistance maintained their resolve was through music and culture. As we saw earlier, music became a form of communication and a source of resistance, but it also served as a powerful tool for maintaining morale. Resistance fighters would often gather to sing songs, share stories, or engage in small cultural activities that allowed them to feel connected to something beyond the war.
These moments of normalcy, however brief, helped them to hold on to their humanity and their spirit in the face of overwhelming odds.
The role of women in the resistance was also a source of strength. Women played a crucial role in keeping communication lines open, carrying messages and taking on vital roles in intelligence and sabotage operations. Despite the heavy psychological toll, many women continue their work in the resistance, supporting their fellow fighters and contributing to the larger cause. Their resilience and determination were crucial in maintaining the spirit of the resistance throughout the war.
As we wrap up this section on the psychological costs of resistance communication, it's clear that the mental strain was an inherent part of this underground network. The constant fear, the isolation, the trust issues, and the pressure to succeed were factors that weighed heavily on the shoulders of everyone involved. And yet, despite this, the resistance endured. They were willing to sacrifice everything for the cause, knowing that their efforts, while often invisible, were a key part of the larger larger fight for freedom. In the next section, we'll shift focus to how these secret communications and their methods had a lasting impact on the world after the war. How did they influence modern day espionage, and what lessons can we learn from the bravery and ingenuity of those who risked everything to stay connected during the darkest days of World War II? Stay tuned. Now that we've explored the incredible psychological toll of living in the shadows during the war, let's take a step back and consider the long-lasting impact that these covert communication methods had on the world after the war. The ingenuity, bravery, and creativity of resistance fighters in World War II didn't just shape the course of the war, they also set the stage for modern-day espionage and covert operations. The methods used to pass messages, keep communication secure, and avoid detection laid the groundwork for many of the techniques we see in intelligence operations today.
Perhaps the most significant legacy of the Resistance's communication efforts lies in the world of modern intelligence gathering. Much of what we consider standard practice in the world of espionage, from the use of encrypted messages to the development of covert signaling techniques, has roots in the methods resistance fighters used to stay connected during the war. The importance of using codes, dead drops, and secret signals didn't disappear when the war ended. Instead, these techniques evolved into the sophisticated systems used by intelligence agencies today.
For example, take a look at the development of modern encryption. During World War II, the resistance relied heavily on cryptography to send secure messages. They used ciphers and codes to scramble their communications, ensuring that even if a message was intercepted, it couldn't be read. The need for secure communication was so paramount that cryptography became one of the key areas of focus for intelligence agencies on both sides of the war. The Enigma machine, famously cracked by Alan Turing and his team at Bletchley Park, is a prime example of how cryptography was used in wartime intelligence. Today, encryption remains a critical part of how intelligence agencies secure their communications and data.
The resistance also pioneered the use of microfilm, which we've discussed earlier. The ability to store large volumes of information in a tiny, nearly undetectable format became an important tool in post-war espionage. Microfilm was used not only for the storage and transport of sensitive information, but also as a precursor to modern-day data storage methods. As digital technologies evolved, the need for secure data storage and transport became even more pressing. And microfilm's influence can still be seen in techniques like data encryption, digital storage, and secure file sharing systems.
But it wasn't just the technology that influenced modern intelligence operations. The psychological lessons learned by resistance groups also made a lasting impact. The need for absolute secrecy, the importance of trust, and the psychological burden of living a double life became critical lessons for the spies and intelligence officers who followed in the footsteps of the resistance fighters. Espionage as it's practiced today is just as much about maintaining emotional and psychological resilience as it is about technological sophistication. Just as resistance fighters had to manage stress, fear, and isolation while staying one step ahead of the enemy, modern spies must navigate similar pressures in their own high-stakes operations.
Resistance communication also laid the groundwork for the kind of decentralized intelligence networks we see today. During the war, small resistance cells operated independently of each other, passing information through trusted couriers using dead drops, and relying on methods like cryptic signals and visual codes to stay connected. This structure of decentralized independent networks has influenced how modern intelligence agencies operate. Today's intelligence operations often rely on smaller, more agile units that can operate without being part of a large centralized structure. This decentralization allows for greater flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing situations, just as it did for the resistance during the war.
One area where the legacy of resistance communication is still felt is in the field of cybersecurity. The need for secure communication and the prevention of interception issues that were of utmost importance during the war are just as crucial in the digital age. Modern encryption algorithms and data security systems owe much to the techniques and methods used by resistance fighters who understood that any lapse in security could expose them to grave danger. Today, cybersecurity professionals and intelligence agencies continue to build on the principles of secrecy encryption and secure communication that were honed during World War II. Even the way we think about covert operations has been shaped by the resistance's methods. The use of misdirection, false identities, and subtle signaling can be seen in the world of modern espionage. Spies today often rely on the same principles that resistance fighters used, hiding in plain sight, using everyday objects for communication, and employing methods that are so ordinary they go unnoticed. In many ways, the lessons learned in the resistance, where trust, secrecy, and resourcefulness were paramount, have become the backbone of modern intelligence operations. Beyond the world of espionage, the legacy of the resistance's communication methods also resonates in the realm of activism and resistance movements today. The idea of staying connected, passing secret messages, and communicating without detection is just as relevant now as it was in World War II. In many parts of the world, people still use covert methods to resist oppressive regimes, relying on encrypted communications, dead drops, and secure channels to organize and mobilize. The lessons learned from the resistance fighters during the war continue to inform how activists communicate and organize today. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the resistance's communication techniques is the spirit of innovation and adaptability. In the face of overwhelming odds, resistance fighters used whatever resources they had at their disposal to communicate, coordinate, and fight back against oppression. They improvised with the tools available to them, from everyday objects to natural elements, and they developed techniques that were ahead of their time. This spirit of resourcefulness, creativity, and determination lives on in the world of intelligence and resistance movements, reminding us that even in the darkest of times, human ingenuity can find a way to thrive. We'll wrap up our journey through this fascinating world of secret communication and resistance operations. We'll take a moment to reflect on the incredible courage and ingenuity of those who fought in the shadows and explore how their legacy continues to inspire us today. Stay tuned for a final reflection on the lessons we can learn
from those who risked everything to stay connected and keep the flame of resistance burning. As we near the end of our journey through the fascinating world of secret communication and resistance operations, it's time to reflect on the incredible courage, ingenuity, and resourcefulness of those who fought in the shadows. The resistance fighters of World War II, often working under unimaginable pressure, pioneered communication methods that not only helped them survive but ultimately contributed to the downfall of oppressive regimes. Their bravery and inventiveness continue to inspire, reminding us of the power of human resilience and creativity, even in the face of overwhelming odds.
One of the most striking things about the resistance is how ordinary people, often living in fear and uncertainty, found ways to create extraordinary solutions. From the use of invisible ink and pigeon messages to microfilm, and even everyday objects like bread and clothing, the resistance showed that communication isn't just about sophisticated technology or encrypted signals. It's about the willingness to adapt, think outside the box, and use whatever resources are available to you. Every letter, every piece of bread, every hidden code was a small act of defiance, a way of keeping hope alive and resisting the tide of oppression.
The communication networks created by the resistance weren't just technical feats, they were also deeply human. These methods, though often based on secrecy and deception, relied on an immense amount of trust. Whether it was a courier carrying a hidden message, a child unknowingly transporting intelligence, or a radio operator broadcasting vital updates, each operation required an unwavering belief in the mission and in each other. Trust wasn't just a luxury, it was a necessity. In the world of secret communication, every success and every failure was shared by a network of people working together, often without knowing the full scope of what was at stake. In many ways, the lessons learned from the resistance are just as relevant today as they were during the war. The methods of covert communication and the principles of resilience continue to inform the way we think about secrecy, security, and human ingenuity in the face of adversity. Modern intelligence agencies, activists, and resistance movements still rely on some of the same principles that guided those in the underground during World War II, whether it's the need for secure communication, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, or the importance of maintaining trust within a network. It's also important to acknowledge the psychological toll that living in secrecy and fear took on those involved. The mental strain of living with the constant possibility of exposure, betrayal, and death was a heavy burden to bear, and the psychological resilience required to carry on despite these fears is nothing short of remarkable. Many resistance fighters suffered in silence, struggling with anxiety, isolation, and the knowledge that their work was fraught with danger. And yet, despite the emotional and psychological costs they continued to fight, their determination is a testament to the power of the human spirit and the unyielding desire for freedom.
But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the resistance's communication efforts is the idea that even in the most dire of circumstances, communication can still thrive. The resistance showed that even when the enemy controls all the major forms of communication, it's still possible to create networks, pass information, and stay connected. They used everyday objects, nature, and creativity to find ways around the most sophisticated surveillance systems. And in doing so, they kept the flame of hope alive. Their ingenuity is not just something to be admired, it's something to learn from. In a world that's constantly changing and facing new challenges, the spirit of innovation, adaptability, and perseverance shown by those in the resistance offers invaluable lessons. They faced enormous obstacles, but they found ways to keep communicating, to keep resisting, and to keep fighting for freedom. In the end, their efforts were part of a larger movement that led to the liberation of Europe and the defeat of Nazi forces.
As we reflect on this journey through the world of secret communication, it's impossible not to be inspired by the resilience of those who, against all odds, found ways to stay connected and keep the fight for freedom alive. Their courage, creativity, and unshakable belief in their cause remind us of the power of human ingenuity and the enduring strength of the human spirits. So, as we close the chapter on these covert methods of communication, remember this. The resistance wasn't just about fighting with weapons or force. It was about using everything at their disposal to outsmart the enemy. Their ability to adapt, innovate, and stay connected in the most challenging of circumstances is a lesson we can all carry forward, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there is always a way to communicate, to resist, and to persevere. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through the secret communication methods of World War II resistance movements. Sweet dreams, and may the courage and ingenuity of those who fought in the shadows continue to inspire you just as it has inspired generations before us. Good night, sweet dreams.